In the ruins of an old chapel, a widow's screams pierce the silence each midnight. She cries for the family she lost to a brutal massacre. But the truth is far darker than anyone can imagine. She wasn't a victim, she was the monster. Trapped by her own guilt and torment, her spirit has cursed the land, and those who hear her screams are driven to madness, never to escape her wrath. But what if you're next? The village of Lankara sat nestled in the shadows of jagged hills, an isolated and forgotten place where time seemed to stand still. The cracked dirt paths wound between crumbling stone houses, and the eerie quiet of the night often brought whispers of unsettling tales, the most terrifying of which revolved around the abandoned well at the edge of the village. It was no ordinary well. Decades ago, it had been sealed with thick wooden planks, bound tightly with rusting iron chains. Villagers avoided it, refusing to even glance in its direction, as though acknowledging its existence might invite its wrath. Children were warned from a young age, stay away from the well, no matter what you hear. The story passed down through generations was one of horror and tragedy. They said the well had swallowed a family whole. 30 years ago, during a drought that parched the land, a family of 4 had moved into the village seeking refuge. Desperate for water, they dared to pry open the well, despite the villagers' frantic warnings. The father was the first to lean over the edge, hoping to glimpse the water said to lie deep within. The villagers who watched from afar described what happened next in hushed, fearful tones. Pale, ghostly hands, thin as twigs and bone white, emerged from the darkness, grabbing the man by the neck and yanking him in. His screams echoed as his wife and 2 children rushed to pull him back. But one by one, the hands seized them too, dragging them into the well's abyss. Their cries for help were swallowed by the darkness, and the well's cover slammed shut on its own. Ever since, whispers claimed that their spirits remained trapped within the well. On certain nights, the sound of their desperate wails would carry through the village, a chilling plea for someone, anyone, to rescue them. But those who dared to approach too closely spoke of icy whispers brushing against their ears, and the sight of bony hands reaching for them from the shadows. The villagers had no choice but to seal the well, hoping to contain whatever malevolent force lurked inside. Yet despite their efforts, the stories persisted. And for those reckless enough to look into the well, the legends warned of one certainty: they would not return. The village of Darawa turned silent by twilight. Even the stray dogs who barked during the day vanished as if sensing the darkness brought something more sinister. Harun's fascination with the well had already begun to gnaw at him. In his room, the whispers haunted him. They weren't external now. They came from within, a chilling tune replaying in his head. He kept telling himself it was the tales getting to him, but deep down, he knew there was more to it. Despite his fear, Harun prepared his camera equipment the next day. Armed with high-powered flashlights, a digital recorder, and a couple of protective talismans handed to him by an old villager, he decided to confront his fears. Joining him reluctantly were Zara and Kabir, 2 fellow ghost hunters who had seen their fair share of haunted sites. Zara, sharp and skeptical, rolled her eyes every time Harun mentioned the whispers, but Kabir, the team's muscle, had started to seem uneasy. "Let's stick to the plan," Harun said, attempting to steady his voice. "We record for an hour near the well and see if we find anything unusual. We stay together, no splitting up. Agreed?" Kabir nodded quickly, but Zara laughed. "I've heard these stories a million times. We'll just end up with footage of wind and rustling leaves." Her confidence reassured no one, least of all herself. As night fell, the trio made their way to the cursed well. The full moon illuminated the village paths, but the closer they got, the more oppressive the air felt. By the time they reached the well, Zara's smug demeanor had vanished, replaced by an uncharacteristic silence. The well loomed before them, its stones cracked and covered in moss. A heavy iron grate had been placed over it, rusted and warped from decades of neglect. The air around it was colder than the rest of the night, a biting chill that crept under their skin. Harun set up the camera while Kabir paced nervously, his flashlight scanning the area. "Do you hear that?" Kabir whispered, his voice barely audible. Zara turned to him, irritated. "What now?" "The whispers." Harun froze, his hands trembling as he adjusted the camera lens. He heard them too, faint overlapping voices calling out from the well. They weren't the imagined whispers he had heard before. These were real, chillingly close, yet impossible to decipher. "Let's record," Haroon said, trying to mask his fear. The camera rolled, capturing the eerie stillness of the well. Moments later, Kabir's flashlight flickered and died. The whispers grew louder. "That's not possible," Kabir muttered, smacking the flashlight. "It's brand new." Zara's sarcasm faltered. "Let's just finish and go." As Haroon adjusted the camera's angle, something caught his eye. The flashlight beam briefly illuminated the well's interior through the gaps in the grate. For a split second, he saw movement, a pale, skeletal hand reaching upward, its fingers impossibly long and twisted. "Stop filming," Kabir hissed, yanking Haroon back. "There's something down there." Haroon glanced at Zara, hoping she'd laugh and dismiss it. Instead, she stared at the well, her face pale. "We're leaving. Now." But Haroon, driven by a mix of fear and curiosity, stepped closer to the grate. "We need to know what's there," he insisted. Suddenly, the whispers turned into a guttural growl. The ground beneath them trembled, and a burst of icy air shot out of the well. The talisman around Haroon's neck burned hot against his skin. "Something's wrong," Zara said, backing away. "We need to leave." But before they could move, the grate over the well rattled violently. Pale hands, dozens of them, shot up from the darkness below, clawing at the metal. The team froze in terror, unable to comprehend what they were seeing. The whispers turned into screams, agonized, pleading screams that echoed through the night. Kabir grabbed Haroon's arm. "Run!" As they bolted from the well, the ground seemed to shift beneath their feet. The path back to the village felt impossibly long, the trees closing in around them. The whispers followed, now mingled with mocking laughter. Kabir tripped, falling hard onto the dirt. Haroon and Zara stopped to help him, but as they pulled him up, they saw dark handprints on his ankle. Handprints that burned into his skin. "It's pulling me back," Kabir gasped, his voice trembling. Haroon tightened his grip. "We won't let it." But the hands weren't done. From the shadows they emerged, spectral, skeletal figures dragging themselves toward the trio. Their hollow eyes glowed faintly, and their mouths moved as if chanting, though no sound escaped. "Run!" Zara screamed, pulling Kabir to his feet. The group sprinted, the ghostly figures in pursuit. The air grew heavier with every step, as though the village itself wanted to keep them from escaping. When they finally reached Haroon's car, they piled in, slamming the door shut. Haroon turned the key, but the engine sputtered and died. "No, no, no," he muttered, trying again. The spectral figures surrounded the car, their skeletal hands pressing against the windows. Zara held up her talisman, pressing it to the glass. The figures recoiled, their shrieks piercing the night. "Try again," Kabir shouted. This time the engine roared to life. Haroon hit the gas and the car sped away, leaving the cursed well behind. But as they drove, the whispers didn't fade. Instead, they grew louder, filling the car with their eerie chant. Haroon glanced in the rearview mirror and froze. Sitting in the back seat, between Zara and Kabir, was a figure cloaked in shadows, its hollow eyes glowing faintly. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the cursed well appeared to grow more sinister under the encroaching darkness. The villagers had long since locked their doors, their prayers hanging heavy in the air as they tried to shield themselves from the night's horrors. Nadim, Sana, and Raymond stood near the well, their torches casting flickering beams against the moss-covered stones. The whispers had returned, faint but insistent, like murmurs from an unseen crowd. "Are you hearing this?" Raymond asked, his voice trembling. Sana clutched her talisman tightly. "It's not just voices," she replied, pointing at the ground near the well. The dirt was shifting, moving as if stirred by invisible hands. A faint mist began to rise, curling upward and spreading like ghostly fingers. Nadim, determined to uncover the truth, shone his torch directly into the well. For a moment there was only darkness, a void so complete it felt as though it might swallow the light. Then as his beam swept across the stones, something moved, a shadow impossibly fast, darting just beyond the edge of the light. "Did you see that?" Nadim exclaimed, backing away. The shadow lingered at the edge of their vision, shapeless yet palpably malevolent. Raymond, emboldened by his growing fear, grabbed the rope tied to the old rusted pulley system. If this thing swallowed people, there might be something down there. We need to find out what. Ignoring the others' protests, he began lowering a camera attached to the rope, its night vision lens transmitting footage to a small screen. The descent was slow and agonizing. The camera showed the inside of the well, wet, slimy stones and roots protruding like skeletal fingers. Then abruptly the screen flickered. The image twisted and warped, and for a brief moment they saw it. A pale, emaciated face staring directly into the lens, its eyes hollow and filled with hatred. "Pull it back! Pull it back!" Sana screamed. Ramon frantically cranked the rope, but the line suddenly went taut. A deep, guttural growl emerged from the well, reverberating through the ground and sending vibrations up their spines. The rope snapped. Before they could react, a wave of cold air surged from the well, extinguishing their torches. The mist thickened, forming shapes, humanoid figures with distorted faces and claw-like hands. The whispers grew louder, overlapping into an unbearable cacophony. "They're coming out!" Nadim shouted. The three stumbled backward, but the mist figures advanced, their movements jerky and unnatural. One reached for Sana, its translucent fingers passing through her arm. She gasped as a searing cold spread through her veins, her skin paling instantly. Raymond swung his flashlight wildly, the beam cutting through the apparitions, but doing nothing to dispel them. "We have to get out of here!" he yelled, grabbing Sana's arm and pulling her away. But Nadim froze, transfixed by the well. A new sound had emerged, low and resonant, like the groan of something ancient awakening. From the depths of the well, a massive shadow began to rise, darker than the surrounding night. Its form was indistinct, constantly shifting, but its presence was suffocating. "This isn't just a cursed well," Nadim whispered, his voice trembling. "It's a doorway, and something's coming through." The ground beneath their feet began to shake, cracks spreading outward from the well. The shadow extended long, spindly limbs that reached toward Nadim. He stumbled back, but the shadow moved with impossible speed, enveloping him. He screamed as his body convulsed, his eyes rolling back into his head. Sana and Raymond could only watch in horror as Nadim's form was lifted off the ground, his screams merging with the eerie whispers. The shadow then dropped him, lifeless, into the well. Suddenly the whispers ceased, the mist began to dissipate, and the shadow retreated into the well's depths. Silence fell over the graveyard, broken only by Sana's sobs and Raymond's ragged breathing. "We have to seal this thing," Raymond said, his voice barely above a whisper. But even as he spoke, the faint sound of whispers began again, growing louder with each passing second. As the villagers fled, leaving behind only their whispered prayers and locked doors, Adam and his team found themselves standing on the edge of the cursed well, its opening now exhaling a faint, icy vapor. The whispers that once seemed sporadic now grew louder, echoing as though an entire crowd of unseen entities clamored beneath the earth. The air itself seemed to vibrate with menace, and each team member felt their courage wavering. Adam suggested a descent into the well, desperate to uncover its secrets, but hesitation swept through the group. "Do you hear them?" shouted one team member, Mira, her voice tinged with panic. "They're calling our names." The group froze. The whispers were now distinct, addressing each of them personally. "Come to us, Mira. Adam. We've been waiting." Their names, spoken in voices both familiar and alien, sliced through the night air. Each team member began hearing the voices of their loved ones. Adam froze as he distinctly heard his late mother calling to him, her tone gentle, pleading. Against better judgment, Adam insisted on sending a small drone down first. As the mechanical hum of the drone disappeared into the abyss, its camera feed displayed jagged walls slick with moisture, glyphs carved into the stone, ancient symbols that seemed to pulse and shimmer. As the drone descended deeper, the voices grew deafening. Suddenly, the feed cut out with a sharp burst of static. The final frame showed a pale, skeletal hand darting toward the lens. The group debated abandoning the investigation entirely, but curiosity and pride got the better of Adam. "We've come this far," he said, gripping the climbing harness. "We can't stop now." One by one, Adam, Mira, and two others descended into the well. The rope creaked under their weight, and the deeper they went, the darker and colder it became. Their flashlights flickered, struggling to cut through the oppressive gloom. The glyphs seemed to writhe as though alive, and an unnatural, bone-deep chill seeped into their skin. When they reached the bottom, they were met with a cavern, unnatural, sprawling, and filled with jagged, uneven walls. The ground was wet, slick with something thicker than water. The whispers had ceased, replaced by a suffocating silence. Yet the feeling of being watched was overwhelming. At the center of the cavern was a pile of bones, human, animal, and something unidentifiable, arranged in a grotesque spiral. Mira's flashlight illuminated a crude altar adorned with decayed offerings, rusted trinkets, torn fabric, and what looked like human teeth. Then they saw it, a faint, shimmering figure standing at the far end of the cavern, its silhouette tall and unnaturally thin. The figure began to move toward them. As it approached, its details became clearer. It was neither alive nor entirely spectral. Its eyes were sunken pits, its mouth stretched into an endless scream, yet no sound emerged. It moved with the slow, deliberate gait of something that knew escape was impossible. The team froze as the figure pointed toward the entrance, a silent command to leave. Adam, defiant, stepped forward. "We want answers," he said, his voice quivering but resolute. The cavern responded. The whispers returned, louder than before, but now they came from all around them. The walls seemed to breathe, the glyphs glowing brighter. The figure's outstretched hand twisted and elongated, reaching for Adam. Panic erupted among the group. One team member bolted for the rope, only to find it severed. No escape. The figure began to speak, its voice a guttural blend of dozens of tones. "The well is not a place for the living. You should have listened to their warnings." As the whispers grew deafening and the cavern seemed to close in on itself, the group realized too late that they had stepped into a trap, a domain not bound by natural laws but by something older, darker. The figure advanced, its skeletal hands reaching out. Sana and Raymond stood frozen, the whispers now replaced by an eerie hum emanating from the well. It was low at first, barely audible, but it rose steadily, filling the air with a sinister vibration that seemed to gnaw at their sanity. Ramon grabbed Sana's hand and pulled her toward the cemetery gates, but the earth quaked violently, knocking them to the ground. The well began to crack and crumble, its stones splitting apart as an unholy light poured from its depths, a sickly, pulsating green that illuminated the night. The light wasn't just bright, it felt alive, and it made their skin crawl as if 1,000 invisible insects were scuttling over their bodies. From the well's core rose something monstrous. It wasn't the shadowy figure they'd seen before. It was worse. Twisted, elongated limbs emerged first, covered in glistening, blackened flesh. Its torso was unnaturally thin, ribs protruding, and its face, it was a shifting mass of agony. Eyes appeared and disappeared, mouths formed and screamed before melting away, leaving only voids behind. Raymond pulled Sana behind a nearby tombstone, shielding her from the creature's gaze. "We need to run," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the creature's guttural growls. "We can't leave it like this," Sana hissed back. "If we run, it'll keep taking people. We have to stop it." Raymond hesitated but nodded. "What do you suggest? That thing is not of this world." Sana stared at the well, her eyes narrowing. "It's bound to the well. If we destroy the well, maybe we can stop it." Raymond glanced at the crumbling stones, the swirling light, and the abomination towering above it. "And how exactly do we destroy it? With a prayer?" "No," Sana said, her voice steady despite her trembling hands. "With fire." Raymond's eyes widened. "Fire? Are you insane? That thing—" "Do you have a better idea?" she snapped. Raymond didn't. He scanned their surroundings and spotted an old oil lantern hanging from a hook near the cemetery's caretaker's shack. "Stay here," he said, and darted toward it. As Raymond sprinted, the creature turned its attention toward him. Its many faces twisted in rage, and it let out a deafening roar. The sound wasn't just loud, it was physical. a force that knocked Raymond off his feet and sent the lantern skidding across the ground. Sana screamed as the creature began to move, its elongated limbs dragging its massive body toward Raymond. Desperate, she grabbed a large rock and hurled it at the creature. It hit one of its many faces, causing it to pause momentarily and shift its attention to her. The creature reared back, its form stretching unnaturally as it prepared to lunge. In that moment, Raymond scrambled to his feet, grabbed the lantern, and lit it with shaking hands. "Sana! Move!" he shouted. Sana dove to the side as Raymond hurled the lantern toward the well. It shattered against the stones, and the oil ignited instantly, flames licking up the sides of the cursed structure. The creature let out an ear-piercing shriek, its form writhing and distorting as the fire spread. But instead of retreating, the creature lunged at Raymond. It wrapped its grotesque limbs around him, dragging him toward the well. "Raymond!" Sana screamed, running toward them, but it was too late. As the fire consumed the well, the light from its depths grew brighter, and the creature, along with Raymond, was pulled into its core. Raymond's final scream echoed through the night before the well collapsed in on itself, leaving only a smoldering crater. Sana fell to her knees, sobbing uncontrollably. The whispers were gone, the light was gone, and the night was eerily silent. She sat there until dawn, staring at the crater, unable to process what had happened. Weeks later, the village seemed to return to normal. The well was gone, and the whispers had ceased. But Sana knew better. She couldn't forget the horror she'd witnessed, nor could she forgive herself for what had happened to Raymond. One night, as she lay in bed, she heard it, a faint whisper. Her blood ran cold as she realized it wasn't coming from outside. It was inside her head. Her reflection in the mirror twisted and distorted, her own eyes turning hollow, her mouth forming a silent scream. The hunger had found a new host, and it was only the beginning. The sun was beginning to set as the four urban explorers made their way down the narrow road leading to the small village of Hollow Creek. Amy, Jake, Simon, and Clara had driven for hours, passing through dense forests and over hills until they finally reached their destination. The village was shrouded in an eerie silence, its buildings crumbling from years of neglect. Amy, the group's historian, was the first to speak. "This is it, Hollow Creek, the forgotten village." Simon, always focused on the task at hand, pulled out his camera and began checking the equipment. "Looks deserted. Should make for a good investigation." Jake, the skeptic, rolled his eyes. "You guys really believe in this ghost stuff? We're here to film a documentary, not chase stories." Clara, who had been silent so far, shivered as a gust of wind swept through the village. "It feels wrong, like something is watching us." Ignoring Clara's unease, Amy led the group down the road toward the old schoolhouse at the heart of the village. The building loomed ahead, its charred remains barely recognizable as a school. The fire that had destroyed it many years ago had left the walls blackened and the windows shattered. "This is it," Amy said. "The Hollow Creek schoolhouse. They say Miss Beatrice, the teacher, and several of her students died here in that fire. Some say their spirits still haunt the place." Jake scoffed. "Sounds like a good story to scare kids. Let's go inside and get this over with." The group made their way toward the schoolhouse, the door creaking open as they pushed it. The air was unnaturally cold inside, and the faint smell of burned wood lingered, even after all these years. The floor was covered in a thick layer of dust, and broken furniture lay scattered throughout the room. "We should set up our equipment," Simon said, pulling out cameras and microphones. "Let's see if we can capture something." As they began setting up, Clara stood near the door, her eyes darting nervously around the room. "I don't know about this," she said, her voice trembling. "There's something in here." Jake, rolling his eyes, dismissed her concerns. "You're just spooked. This place is old, that's all." But as the group continued to set up their gear, something strange happened. A faint sound, like the ringing of a bell, echoed through the room. The sound seemed to come from nowhere, and yet it felt all too real. Amy froze. "Did you hear that?" Simon looked up from his equipment, a frown crossing his face. "The bell tower burned down with the fire. There's no way a bell should be ringing." But the bell rang again, its sound clear and chilling. Clara felt a cold shiver run down her spine. "This isn't right. We should leave." But it was too late. The schoolhouse had already begun to claim them. The explorers ventured deeper into the schoolhouse. The walls were covered with soot, and old broken desks sat in disarray. The classroom, once filled with the laughter of children, was now an empty, mournful shell. The floorboards creaked under their weight as they walked through the room, their flashlights cutting through the darkness. Amy walked over to a faded plaque on the wall. She wiped away the grime and dust to reveal the words, "Dedicated to Miss Beatrice, whose spirit shall forever guide our children." "That's the teacher," Amy whispered. "She died in the fire." Jake raised an eyebrow. "So what? The whole town probably has a plaque for her. Doesn't mean there's a ghost here." But as they continued their exploration, the atmosphere grew heavier. Clara's flashlight flickered and then went out completely. "It's cold in here," she said, her voice barely audible. "I feel like something's watching us." The group moved toward the main classroom, the door creaking open as they approached. Inside, they found a scene that defied all logic. The desks were arranged in perfect rows, as if they had been meticulously placed by invisible hands. The chalkboard at the front of the room was covered with lessons, fresh lessons, written in crisp, white chalk. This can't be real," Simon muttered, his camera trembling in his hands. Amy stepped forward, her heart pounding in her chest. "This place hasn't been used in decades. How can there be fresh chalk on the board?" Before anyone could respond, the chalkboard began to change. New words appeared, as if written by an unseen hand. "Class is in session." The temperature dropped suddenly, and the room filled with an eerie, childlike laughter. It was faint at first, but it quickly grew louder, more menacing. The sound of a bell tolling filled the air once more, louder than ever. Jake's face went pale. "This isn't happening," he said, backing away. "We need to get out of here, now." But as they tried to leave, the door slammed shut. The group was trapped. The room felt unnervingly cold, and the moment they entered the classroom, a palpable sense of unease washed over them. The strange ringing of the bell had stopped, but the echo still lingered in the air. Clara stood near the door, her hands trembling as she held her flashlight, its beam flickering sporadically. It was as though the very air in the room was alive, charged with an energy that made her skin crawl. "This isn't right," Clara whispered, barely audible. "This place, it's not just abandoned, it's trapped." Jake scoffed, trying to rationalize the situation as nothing more than a creepy old schoolhouse with a few too many coincidences. "Look, it's just an old building. Old buildings creak, they make noises. The chalkboard's probably a prank or something. Let's just film it and get out of here." But Amy wasn't so easily convinced. Her fingers ran along the edges of the chalkboard, feeling the chalk dust that had settled on the surface. It was only then that she noticed something odd. Fresh chalk marks. The writing on the board wasn't just remnants of past lessons. It was as if someone had just written it. Her fingers hovered over the text, feeling a strange pull, as if the words were alive and waiting for her to touch them. "Look at this," Amy said, her voice strained. She stepped closer, pointing at the words that had appeared on the chalkboard. "It says, 'Class is in session.'" Before anyone could respond, the chalkboard began to change again. The words shifted and reformed before their eyes. "Stay. Listen. Learn." The temperature dropped in the room, a sudden chill that froze the air. A gust of wind swept through the broken windows, causing the curtains to flutter, but there was no breeze outside. The room felt closed off, as though they were in a vacuum. "Did you see that?" Simon asked, his voice sharp with disbelief. He was standing by the window, his camera aimed at the door, but he wasn't focusing on what was in front of him. His attention was fixated on the edges of the chalkboard where the words had written themselves, erasing and rewriting in a constant loop. Suddenly, the classroom seemed to come alive with sound. First, a faint giggle, soft and childlike, echoed through the walls. It started distant, but it grew louder with each passing second, until it was so clear, so unnervingly real, that it filled the room like a deafening chorus of children's voices. "Who's there?" Amy called out, her voice trembling despite her attempts to sound confident. There was no answer, only the laughter, now joined by the soft, rhythmic tapping of tiny footsteps running across the floor. Her flashlight flickered wildly as if struggling to stay powered. And then, just as abruptly, the laughter stopped. The sudden silence was deafening, but it didn't last long. The laughter morphed into something darker. Sharp, piercing screams, the kind that sent a chill straight through to the bone. They were the screams of children, caught in the middle of something unspeakable. The room felt as though it were closing in, suffocating them with its heavy, unnatural presence. Clara stepped back, her hands pressed to her ears as if trying to block out the terrifying cries. "We need to leave. We need to leave now." But Jake, ever the skeptic, remained rooted to the spot, his eyes scanning the room with increasing confusion and frustration. "This is ridiculous. There's no way this is real. It's just an old schoolhouse, and our minds are playing tricks on us. Let's just turn the camera on, get some evidence, and get out of here." Amy turned to Simon, who had been filming everything, his face pale as he panned the camera across the room. "Simon, are you getting this? You hear the voices, right?" Simon didn't answer immediately. His hands shook as he adjusted the camera settings, trying to focus on the classroom's dark corners, but the lens flickered. The distortion in the footage made everything appear as though it were melting, the edges of the classroom warping, twisting into grotesque, blurry shapes. Suddenly, the lights in the room flickered and then went out completely, plunging them into total darkness. The only sound that remained was the frantic breathing of the group, punctuated by the soft click of the camera turning off. "We're not alone," Clara whispered again, her voice quivering as she reached out in the dark, hoping to find someone, anyone, to make sense of this. "Can't you feel it? There's something here, something watching us." In the pitch-black room, the temperature continued to drop. The chills seeped into their bones as though the air itself was being sucked away. Amy, unable to see anything, reached into her bag and pulled out a flashlight. When she clicked it on, the beam revealed the chalkboard again, but this time, the message had changed once more. "Your lesson has begun." The faint sound of a bell tolling echoed in the distance, although there was no bell left in the schoolhouse, no bell tower to ring. The sound was distorted, as though it had traveled through time itself, pulling them back to a moment long past. A lingering sense of dread took hold of their hearts, suffocating their thoughts. I think we should go." "Now," Simon said, his voice cracking as he backed toward the door. This is too much." But the door wouldn't open. No matter how hard they tried, it refused to budge, as though it had been locked by an invisible force. Panic surged through their veins as they rattled the doorknob, pushing against the heavy wooden frame, but it was useless. "I don't think it's just locked," Amy said, her voice rising with fear. "I think we're trapped in here." The laughter returned, louder this time, echoing through every corner of the room, reverberating in their skulls. It was followed by the whispers, faint at first but growing clearer with every passing second. The words weren't distinguishable, just a soft murmur, like a chant, filling the room with an ominous tone. Clara gripped her flashlight tighter. Her eyes darted around the room as though searching for something, anything, that would give them an answer. I think they want us to stay," she said, her voice hollow. "This room, this place, it's not just haunted, it's alive." The walls seemed to pulse with a strange, rhythmic energy. The shadows in the corners of the room deepened, taking on form, shapes that loomed over them, impossible to ignore. They weren't just figments of imagination, they were real. Real enough to make Clara's heart race in her chest. Jake turned to Amy, his face contorted with disbelief. "What do we do now? This can't be happening. It's just a building. It has to be." But as he spoke, one of the shadows moved, sliding along the wall, reaching toward him like an elongated arm. His breath caught in his throat as the shadow curled around his ankle, its touch freezing, sending a shock of terror through him. He yanked his leg back, but the shadow remained, its form now clearly visible. A child's hand, pale and skeletal, dragging itself along the floor. Simon, who had been filming this entire time, backed away, his face a mixture of awe and horror. I don't know what this is," he muttered. But it was clear he was no longer speaking to anyone in particular. His eyes were wide with shock, unable to process the horror unfolding in front of him. The laughter grew louder, more frantic, and the chalkboard once again began to change. Stay with us forever. A sudden cold wind swept through the classroom, rattling the windows, and the door slammed shut, the sound like a gunshot in the silence. The group was trapped, and they weren't alone anymore. The air was thick with an oppressive energy that made it hard to breathe. Clara's chest tightened as she stood, paralyzed with fear. The shadow of the child's hand still lingered on the floor, its fingers twitching, reaching for her. She could feel its coldness even from where she stood. The other shadows in the room grew more distinct. Human forms, now standing at the edges of the room, watching them. "I can't breathe," Clara gasped, her voice barely audible. It's suffocating me." Jake, his face pale and trembling, still clung to the door, trying with all his might to force it open. But it remained steadfast, as if some unseen force had latched onto it, keeping them locked inside. His hands slid down the door in defeat, and he turned to the others, his eyes wide with terror. "We need to get out. This isn't real. This can't be real," Jake muttered, but the uncertainty in his voice betrayed his words. He was no longer convinced this was just a prank or some old abandoned building. Something was here, something terrible. The children's laughter returned, louder now, as if they were standing right next to them. Their giggles rang out like an eerie symphony, reverberating in the walls, shaking the floor beneath them. Clara closed her eyes, willing the sounds to go away. But they only grew more distinct, their voices twisted into dark, mocking tones. "Stay with us forever." The whisper was unmistakable, and it came from all around them. It felt like a physical presence, brushing against their skin, creeping under their clothing. Clara snapped her eyes open, her flashlight trembling in her hand. The figures in the room were no longer just shadows. They were real. The figures of children, pale, disfigured, their faces contorted in anguish, stepped forward from the dark corners, their bodies flickering in and out of view like ghosts struggling to stay anchored in this world. Their eyes, black and lifeless, stared at the group with an unrelenting intensity, as though they could see into their very souls. "No!" Clara gasped, taking a step back, her legs weak beneath her. "No, please, this isn't real." But they weren't listening. The figures began to move toward them, slowly at first and then faster, their movements jerky, unnatural. The floorboards creaked under their weight, though there was no sign of them actually touching the ground. The children, no. The apparitions surrounded the group, their hollow eyes locked on each of them. Jake backed away from the door, panic setting in. "What the hell is happening?" he shouted, but his voice cracked, failing to sound authoritative. It was too late for questions. The room had become a living nightmare. A loud crash echoed from somewhere deep within the school, followed by the unmistakable sound of footsteps. Heavy, deliberate steps. Something, or someone, was moving inside, moving toward them. "Look!" Amy screamed, pointing towards the back of the classroom. Emerging from the shadows, a figure stepped forward, tall, imposing, with a face shrouded in darkness. The only thing visible were the bright, fiery eyes that burned like embers in the night. Its body was draped in tattered clothing, remnants of a time long past. But what made the figure truly terrifying was the smell, a foul stench of burning flesh, of something that had long since rotted but refused to die. It was her, the teacher, the phantom of the schoolhouse. The figure raised its arms, long and thin, and the air seemed to freeze as if in anticipation. Clara's blood ran cold as she realized what was happening. They weren't just trapped in this room. They were trapped in a moment of time, a moment that repeated itself over and over again. The teacher had been caught in this cycle, and now they too were part of it. The teacher's voice, low and guttural, boomed through the room, causing the walls to shake. "You are late," it whispered, the words laced with venom. "I was waiting for you." The ground beneath their feet trembled as the room began to shift. The classroom seemed to expand and contract, warping and twisting as though reality itself was bending. The schoolhouse had never truly been abandoned. It had been waiting for them. The chalkboard, once again, began to rewrite itself. Welcome to your lesson. And then, a horrifying realization hit them. The children, the ones who had been haunting the room, were not ghosts. They were prisoners, just like them. Each child had a different expression. Some twisted in agony, some frozen in fear. But all were desperately reaching out with their eyes, pleading for help, trapped in an endless loop, forever bound to the schoolhouse. The teacher, no longer a person, but a creature of nightmare, moved closer, her footsteps sending tremors through the floor. "You have entered my classroom," she said, her voice now sharp, filled with malice, "and you will never leave." Suddenly, the room seemed to close in on them. The walls pressed together as though the building itself were trying to consume them. Clara screamed, feeling the air sucked out of her lungs. Her heart pounded as her vision blurred, the light from her flashlight flickering weakly. The children's laughter filled her ears once again, louder, more desperate. The classroom spun, the desks and chairs flying around her like debris in a storm. And then everything stopped. The room became still. The laughter ceased. The shadows retreated back into the corners. Clara's breathing was ragged, her chest rising and falling violently as she tried to make sense of what had just happened. But when she looked around, everything was different. The schoolhouse wasn't decayed or dilapidated anymore. It had been restored to its former state, bright, clean, and new. The desks were neatly arranged, the chalkboard flawless with new lessons written upon it, and the teacher was gone. For a moment, they all stood in stunned silence, unsure of what was real anymore. Were they back in the past? Had they been freed? Clara took a hesitant step forward, but as soon as her foot hit the floor, the room seemed to pulse with an invisible energy. The chalkboard glowed faintly, and the words began to write themselves again. "Class is in session." And then the bell tolled. The children's laughter returned, not as a distant echo, but as if they were standing right beside them. And the teacher, now standing at the front of the room, her eyes burning with an otherworldly fire, turned toward them, her face contorted in a twisted smile. "You are here to learn," she hissed, "and you will never leave." The door had disappeared, replaced with a solid wall. The windows were no longer visible. The classroom was enclosed in an endless void, a space that existed only to trap them in its terrible, suffocating grasp. Clara's eyes widened in horror as the truth dawned upon her. They were no longer guests of this place. They were part of its cursed history, part of the lesson that had to be taught over and over again. And as the final bell rang, Clara understood. There would be no escape. The schoolhouse had claimed them. They were its students now, and they would never leave. The village of Oak Hollow was small, smaller than most. It sat nestled in a valley surrounded by dense woods that stretched beyond the horizon. The village was quiet, peaceful, but its tranquility masked a history of fear and unease. The Whispering Woods, as the villagers called it, loomed on the outskirts like a dark sentinel. Everyone in Oak Hollow knew the woods were dangerous, but it was the stories that made them infamous. At night, the wind carried strange whispers, barely audible, but distinct. They seemed to call names. Sometimes they called out to villagers who had long since left or passed, and sometimes they called for those who dared venture too close. It was said that those who followed the whispers were never seen again. Thomas had been one of those children who had grown up listening to the tales of the Whispering Woods. His mother often warned him never to stray too far from the village, especially after dusk. The other villagers, too, had their own warnings, but they were mostly spoken in hushed tones, around fires or in the corners of the tavern. "You can't trust the woods," they'd say. "They're cursed. You don't follow the whispers." But Thomas, curious and adventurous, never quite believed the stories. To him, the whispers were just that, stories. Yet something about them nagged at him, stirred a sense of unease in his chest whenever the wind howled late at night. There were nights when, despite the warnings, Thomas would creep to the edge of the woods, drawn by the sound of his name carried on the breeze. It was a Sunday afternoon when Thomas disappeared. He had been out playing with the other children, his usual energy infectious. But by sunset, the other children had gone home, and Thomas had yet to return. His mother, Elena, had called for him from the porch, her voice filled with that motherly warmth and concern. But there was no answer. Worry settled in her chest as the minutes passed, then hours. She called again, louder this time, but still there was no response. At dusk, the village became filled with hushed murmurs. One by one, the villagers began to gather, their faces creased with concern. Some were skeptical that anything was wrong. After all, children wandered off all the time. But the older folk, particularly the elder Amos, knew better. The woods had claimed more than one child over the years. Elena, frantic with worry, turned to Amos. The old man was revered in the village, his wisdom born of years of experience and strange knowledge. His dark, weary eyes knew more than he ever let on, and now in the face of Thomas's disappearance, they were filled with something darker than worry. They were filled with the kind of fear that only came from knowledge of the true danger that lurked in those woods. "Please, Amos," Elena begged, "help me find my son. He wouldn't have gone into the woods. He knows better." Amos shook his head slowly, his lips tight. "The woods. They call, Elena. They've called before, and they'll call again." "What do you mean?" Elena asked, her voice shaking. "I mean," Amos said, taking a slow, measured breath, "the woods don't just take anyone. They take those whose names they call, those who listen." Elena's heart froze, the words chilling her to the bone. "What happens to them? Where do they go?" "They don't go anywhere," Amos replied softly. "They stay. The woods claim them, and they change. They become part of it. It's the spirits of those wrongfully buried, of those who were not given proper rest. They dwell in the woods, and they are always hungry for more." The villagers gathered in a tight circle, their eyes wide with fear as Amos's words settled over them. No one spoke for a long moment. They all knew the stories, the disappearances that had plagued the village for generations, but hearing them so plainly, so directly from the elder, made the truth far more terrifying. The search that night was futile. Despite all their efforts, despite their best hopes, no one could find Thomas. And so, the village waited. They waited for a miracle that never came, and by morning, they had resigned themselves to the idea that Thomas had simply disappeared into the whispering woods, as so many others had before him. But the worst part was the silence. The silence that followed his disappearance was suffocating, pressing down on the village like an unseen weight. For weeks, the whispers grew louder, and the wind began to howl with a new intensity. Those who had ventured close to the woods claimed they heard Thomas's voice, faint and distorted, calling from somewhere deep within. Then one fateful evening, just over a year later, something inexplicable happened. It was late in the afternoon when the first signs of Thomas's return began to show. Elena was sitting by the hearth, her hands trembling as she worked the old spinning wheel. Her mind was far from the work in her hands. It always drifted back to the woods, to the memories of her son's smile, to the empty space where his laughter should have been. And then there was a knock at the door. Elena's heart skipped. She rose from her chair and opened the door, her breath catching in her throat when she saw the figure standing there. It was Thomas. He stood on the threshold, looking exactly the same as the day he had disappeared. His clothes were slightly tattered, and his skin was pale, but otherwise he seemed unharmed. His face, however, was different. It held a strange emptiness, as though a part of him was no longer fully there. "Thomas," Elena whispered, her voice trembling. She reached out, her hands hovering above him as though afraid to touch him. "Mother," he said softly, his voice hollow and distant. He looked up at her with empty black eyes, eyes that seemed to have no life, no warmth, no recognition. Elena recoiled, stepping back in terror, but Thomas's hand reached out, grabbing her wrist with an unnatural force. "I'm back, Mother," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the wind. "But I'm not alone." And as Elena stared into his eyes, the whispers from the woods seemed to grow louder, closer. Behind Thomas, a shadow stirred in the trees, and Elena could feel something else, something far darker, moving closer. She could no longer tell where the boy ended and the spirits began. She could only feel the dread that clung to him, the coldness that had seeped into his very being. The boy's figure had already disappeared into the woods, swallowed by the dark expanse that had claimed him for so many years. The wind had picked up once again, carrying with it the whispers that had called Thomas back. And now the villagers were left with a chilling silence, broken only by the sound of their own breathing. His mother stood motionless, her heart shattered into pieces. She felt as though she had lost him all over again, except this time it was not to the woods, but to something far darker. Her hands trembled as she clutched the fabric of her dress, the coldness of fear creeping into her bones. "We can't let him go," she whispered, her voice barely audible. But no one moved. No one dared to follow. The villagers had heard the elders' warnings about the whispering woods, and they knew better than to ignore them. But none had expected Thomas to return like this. His return felt like an omen, a harbinger of something worse to come. Amos had tried to prepare them, but it was too late now. The boy was lost to them in more ways than one. After a long moment of tense silence, Amos finally spoke again, his voice low and steady. "We must not follow him," he said, his words firm with the weight of years of wisdom. "The woods claim what they take, and they never give it back, not without a price." The villagers gathered closer around the elder, their faces pale with fear and confusion. "What do you mean? What price?" one of them asked, his voice shaking. Amos looked around at the anxious faces before him, his expression heavy. "The price is what the woods demand," he replied quietly. "The spirits of those wrongfully buried there, those who were denied proper burial, they are restless. They've been calling to him, pulling him back. They will not rest until they've claimed every soul they can. We must not venture into the woods to retrieve him. It would be our doom." "But he's our boy," his mother protested, her voice rising. "He's my son. I can't just let him be lost to the woods like this." Amos placed a hand on her shoulder, his touch gentle but firm. "I understand your pain, but you must understand the danger. The woods take more than just your body. They take your soul, and once you're claimed, you are forever bound to them." The wind howled as the whispers grew louder. The sound of Thomas's name, repeated, insistent, almost pleading, seemed to hang in the air. The boy's mother stood frozen, her tears silently falling as she listened to the calls of her son. It was a sound that could tear at anyone's heart, and she felt herself trembling under its weight. But the others stood resolute. They couldn't risk losing more of their people to the woods. The village, already so small and fractured from the many years of inexplicable disappearances, couldn't afford to lose anyone else. Then came the flash of something that caught the eye of one of the villagers. A sudden, fleeting movement just beyond the trees at the edge of the forest. A shadow. No, not just one shadow. Dozens. They were watching. Amos turned toward the woods, his face filled with dread. "They are here," he murmured. "They've come for us." It was then that the ground beneath them seemed to shift. The earth vibrated slightly, a low hum building in intensity. The whispering voices grew louder, now sounding like a chorus of voices all speaking in unison, calling the villagers by name. The spirits that had been buried in the woods were stirring, restless and angry. Their vengeance would not be satisfied with just one boy. They had come for all of them. The villagers started backing away, their feet shuffling as their hearts raced. But no matter how far they tried to retreat, the voices of the spirits seemed to draw closer, wrapping around them, suffocating them in the heavy silence that followed. There was no escape. And then just as suddenly as it had all started, the wind stopped. The world went still. The forest seemed to hold its breath. The villagers looked at one another, unsure whether to move or to wait. They were frozen, caught in the grip of something they couldn't understand. And then from the very center of the woods, there was a sound, a low, mournful cry. It was Thomas. His voice was no longer the innocent young voice that had called out to them. No, now it was something else. It was twisted, warped by time, by the dark forces that had claimed him. And as the villagers turned to face the woods, they saw something far worse than they could have ever imagined. Emerging from the trees was Thomas, but not the boy they had known. His eyes were hollow, black pits that seemed to stare through them, into their very souls. His body was contorted, as if something inside him had been broken. His skin, pale and cold, hung loosely from his frame. He looked as though he had aged 100 years in the span of a moment. Behind him, shapes, moved, shifting in the shadows of the trees. Figures emerged, one after another, their forms indistinct, their faces obscured, but their presence unmistakable. They were the spirits, the restless dead that had been denied peace, and they were hungry. The villagers took a collective step back, but Thomas's eyes, those soulless, empty eyes, locked onto them, and they froze. His voice, distorted and low, echoed in their minds. "You should have listened," he whispered. "You should have stayed away." The village of Oak Hollow had never been the same after Thomas's disappearance. The streets, once full of children's laughter and the buzz of everyday life, now felt eerily empty. The villagers went about their tasks in silence, their heads down, their eyes avoiding one another. Fear, like an insidious mist, had crept into every corner of the village, settling in the bones of the people. The woods, those dark, whispering woods, had claimed another child. And yet Thomas's return had shattered any fragile sense of normality that might have remained. Elena's heart raced as she stood in the doorway, staring at her son. He had returned. But this was not the boy who had laughed and played in the sun. No, this was a hollow version of him. A boy with eyes that glistened like dark pools of ink, cold and empty, as though the very essence of his soul had been stripped away. She had recoiled when she first saw him, but the moment she saw his outstretched hand, something inside her compelled her to reach for him. Her fingers brushed against his, cold as ice. His touch sent a shock of dread through her, but she couldn't pull away. "Thomas," she whispered, her voice breaking. "What happened to you?" "I was lost, Mother," he murmured softly, his voice distant and hollow. "But I'm found now." The words should have been comforting, should have brought relief, but there was nothing reassuring about them. His tone, so flat, so void of emotion, sent a chill down her spine. And as he spoke, Elena noticed something strange, a slight shudder, a twitch in his face, almost imperceptible, like the flicker of a candle about to go out. Her mind raced. This wasn't right. Her son hadn't returned. Something else had. But what? You're not the same," Elena stammered. She stepped back from him, her heart racing as her instincts screamed at her to run. The wind picked up, howling through the trees, carrying the unmistakable whispers of the woods. They were louder now, almost frantic, as though the trees themselves were alive, calling out for something. Someone. "Where have you been?" Elena asked, her voice barely a whisper. Her hands trembled as she reached out again, but this time she couldn't bring herself to touch him. "Tell me where you've been. What happened to you?" Thomas's eyes widened, a brief flicker of something more human in their depths. But it was fleeting. He smiled, but it was not the smile of her son. It was a smile too wide, too sharp, something unnatural. "I've been with them," he said, his words like a sickly chant. "I've been with the others, the ones who never left, the ones who are waiting." Before Elena could speak, there was a sound, soft, barely perceptible at first, but growing louder by the second. The whispers. They were calling again, but this time they were not just in the wind. They were coming from Thomas, his lips barely moving, as though the sound was seeping from him, from within. "Follow. Join us. Stay with us." Elena's blood ran cold. The whispers were not coming from the woods this time. They were coming from him. And as she looked into his eyes, she saw something inhuman. It was as if the woods had taken his spirit and replaced it with something dark, something twisted. She stepped back, fear flooding her chest. "No! Thomas, you're not my son! You're not my son!" she cried, her voice trembling. But Thomas just stood there, silent, the smile still frozen on his face. And then, something worse happened. From behind him, a shadow began to stretch. It was dark and thick, crawling out from the depths of the woods, inching closer to the house. Elena's breath hitched in her throat. The shadow was not like any natural darkness. It seemed alive, pulsating, as though it was a part of him. The air grew colder, the whispers intensifying, drowning out all sound except for the faint echo of her son's name in the distance. A low growl reverberated through the ground, vibrating the very walls of the house. Elena turned her head, her eyes wide with terror. There, standing at the edge of the yard, were figures. They were barely visible at first, just shadows among shadows. But as they emerged from the depths of the woods, their forms became clear. There were dozens of them. People, no, things. Their faces were distorted, as though they had been stretched, mangled beyond recognition. Their skin was ashen, pale, almost translucent, and their eyes were black voids, empty as the depths of the forest. They had no expression, no humanity in their gaze. They were nothing but husks, bodies with no souls. And they were moving toward the house, their footsteps silent, their eyes locked on Elena with an unnerving focus. Thomas didn't seem to notice the creatures that gathered behind him, or if he did, he didn't care. He simply stood in the doorway, waiting, his eyes still empty, his smile still wide and sharp. "They've come for you, Mother," he said softly, the words almost drowned out by the growing cacophony of whispers. "They've come to take you too." A scream caught in Elena's throat, but before she could act, Thomas stepped forward, his hand reaching out to her once more. His fingers, cold and unyielding, wrapped around her wrist. The touch sent a violent shock through her, and the ground beneath her feet trembled, as though the earth itself was trying to pull her into the darkness. "No!" she gasped, wrenching her arm free. "Stay away from me!" But it was too late. The shadow was already crawling across the ground, spreading like ink over a page. It surrounded Thomas and the other creatures, consuming the house, the yard, the very air. And as Elena tried to run, she felt herself drawn back, pulled toward the darkness, toward the figures that were closing in on her. The last thing she saw before the darkness consumed her was Thomas's smile, a smile that had no warmth, a smile that belonged to the woods. The village of Oak Hollow would never be the same again. The next morning, when the villagers ventured out to search for Elena, they found the house empty. There was no trace of her, no sign that she had ever existed. Only Thomas remained, standing at the edge of the woods, his eyes dark and empty, waiting for the next soul to call. And somewhere, deep within the whispering woods, the whispers continued. They were louder now. They were no longer just calling for the lost. They were calling for everyone. The days following Elena's disappearance were suffocatingly quiet in the village. The once bustling streets were now filled with a heavy silence, a quiet that spoke volumes. Whispers of her fate lingered on the wind, though no one dared speak her name aloud anymore. There was an unsettling fear that had settled into the hearts of the villagers, a fear that they were living on borrowed time. The elder, known to all simply as Old Thomas, was the only one who seemed to retain a shred of resolve. His weathered face showed no signs of surprise when the rumors about Elena's fate reached his ears. He had known the wood's hunger long before the boy had returned, long before the first whispers had been heard. He knew it was only a matter of time before it came to claim another. By day, the woods seemed to lay still, as if they were only a quiet shadow against the village. But by night, the darkness grew alive. The whispers were louder now, and the air itself seemed to hum with an unnatural presence. It called to those who were vulnerable, seeking the lost souls to join its eternal, torturous embrace. That night, as the moon hung full in the sky, a new presence entered the village. Someone uninvited, unwelcome, and strange. It was a young man, appearing no older than when he had disappeared all those years ago. The villagers stared, confused and horrified, for they had all believed him lost to the woods. The same boy who had ventured into the forest with Elena, only to never return. Yet here he stood, his face unchanged by the passing of years, his eyes hollow and distant. They all whispered behind their doors, watching as he moved like a ghost through the village, as if drawn towards something unseen. His presence was an omen, a herald of the darkness that had slumbered in the woods for so long, now awakened and hungry. Old Thomas was the first to approach him. The boy's name was Ivar, and once he had been a curious child, full of life and wonder, but now there was only an eerie calm about him. "Ivar," Thomas said, his voice low and steady, though his heart was thundering in his chest. "You've returned, but how? What happened to you out there? Why haven't you aged?" Ivar's gaze never wavered from Thomas as he spoke, his voice quiet but chilling. The woods. They don't forget. Time there has no meaning. I've been waiting for the right moment. Tomas took a step back, fear crawling up his spine. Waiting for what? For the ones who called to me, Ivar whispered. I was meant to return. I was meant to bring them back. A sudden gust of wind whipped through the village, carrying with it the whispers of the forest, faint but growing louder. The trees groaned in response as though they were alive, as though they were anticipating something. The villagers, now peering out from their windows, heard it too. Soft murmurs like distant voices calling from beyond the veil. Ivar, Thomas whispered, his voice shaking. No. You didn't bring them back, did you? The boy smiled, though there was no warmth in it. It's too late. Before Tomas could react, the boy's form flickered. A sudden, oppressive darkness seemed to swell around him, swallowing the light. The air grew heavy, suffocating, and the whispers rose to a cacophony of voices. Thomas stumbled backward, his breath ragged. What have you done? Ivar's form began to shift, melting into the shadows. His body elongated unnaturally, his skin stretched and torn, revealing something grotesque underneath. His eyes, once human, had become empty black pits, hollow and soulless. His mouth twisted into an inhuman grin, as if mocking Tomas for his attempts to understand. I've opened the way, Ivar said, his voice now an unsettling mix of multiple voices, layered and distorted, echoing through the very fabric of reality itself. They're here, and they won't be stopped. Suddenly, from the direction of the woods, a figure appeared. It was Elena, her eyes wide and unblinking, her face pale and lifeless. She walked like a puppet on strings, her movements jerky and unnatural, as though she was no longer truly alive. Her mouth hung open, but no sound came from it. She walked toward Ivar, and in her wake, other shapes emerged from the woods. Figures that had once been human, but were now something else entirely. The villagers screamed as they saw the figures emerge from the trees, faces twisted in agony and rage, skin peeling away to reveal something monstrous beneath. These were the souls of those who had been claimed by the woods, their spirits bound to the forest by an ancient curse, condemned to wander between worlds for all eternity. I've brought them back, Ivar repeated, his voice cold and final. Now they take what is theirs. The spirits surrounded Ivar, their bodies merging with his, as if he were the vessel that would channel their wrath. The earth itself seemed to tremble beneath their feet, and the wind howled like a banshee's wail. The very forest behind them began to bend and twist, the trees reaching out like clawed hands, eager to tear everything in their path apart. One by one, the villagers were dragged into the woods, their screams lost in the unrelenting fury of the spirits. The shadows seemed to consume everything in its path, the land itself becoming a vast graveyard. Those who tried to run found themselves lost, the paths changing with every step, as if the woods themselves were a labyrinth designed to trap them forever. Thomas, in his final moments, realized the terrible truth. The woods had never truly been dormant. The curse had been waiting, slowly feeding on the souls of the lost, growing stronger with each passing year. Elena had not returned, not as herself, but as a vessel for something far darker. As Thomas was pulled into the darkness, the whispers grew deafening. The spirits had come to claim their own, and the village, once peaceful, now consumed by the hunger of the woods, was nothing more than a tombstone, a warning to anyone who dared to listen to the call of the forest. The whispering woods had claimed yet another soul, and it would continue to call out, waiting for the next to wander too close. For the spirits of the woods were not bound by time or death, and they would never stop seeking those who dared to listen. It had always been a well-known tale in the village, one that was whispered in hushed voices when the wind howled and the night grew thick with mystery. The path that led out of the village, known as Lantern Road, was a place of dread, even for the bravest souls. It was said that at dusk, when the light from the village began to dim, a ghostly figure could be seen wandering the path, a bride in a tattered gown, holding a lantern in her delicate hand. She was always searching for something, or someone, and the villagers knew better than to ask too many questions. Some claimed she had been a young woman who had once lived in the village, promised to be wed to a handsome young man, but fate had cruelly torn them apart on the night of her wedding. Others said she had never been real at all, that she was a creation of the villagers' overactive imaginations, twisted over the years into something dark and terrifying. Regardless of the truth, the villagers kept their distance. No one ventured near Lantern Road after nightfall, not unless they had a death wish. The path was not just haunted by the bride's mournful wails, but by something far more sinister. Those who had dared to walk it after dark, who had been foolish enough to meet her gaze, had vanished without a trace. No one returned. One evening, as dusk settled and the shadows stretched long over the village, a traveler arrived. His name was Thomas, a man of little belief in superstition and far too curious for his own good. He had heard of the stories, of course, but like many who passed through the village, he had dismissed them as nothing more than old wives' tales. But something about the eerie quiet that surrounded Lantern Road intrigued him. He had seen the glowing lantern in the distance the night before, and his desire to uncover the truth burned bright. "You must stay away from Lantern Road," the innkeeper had warned him that morning, his voice low, full of concern. "It's not a place for the living, especially at night. There's talk of a bride, yes, but no one's seen her and lived to tell the tale." Thomas chuckled, waving away the warning with a casual gesture. "Superstitions," he muttered, rolling his eyes. "I'm not afraid of ghost stories." The innkeeper shook his head. "You're a fool if you think that. The bride, she's not a simple ghost. She's something else. Don't go, young man." But Thomas was not one to be deterred. The night was falling, and his curiosity burned hotter than ever. He set off toward Lantern Road, determined to see the legend for himself. The air grew colder as he walked the deserted road, his footsteps the only sound that broke the oppressive silence. The moon hung low in the sky, casting pale light over the winding path. Trees loomed on either side, their branches stretching out like gnarled fingers. Despite his bravado, Thomas couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. Every now and then, he thought he saw flickering lights in the distance, small glowing orbs that seemed to float above the ground. But there was no mistaking it now. The faint glow ahead was no trick of the light. It was a lantern, swinging gently from a delicate hand. Thomas's heart skipped a beat as he continued forward, his breath misting in the air. And then, from between the trees, she appeared, a figure draped in white, her face obscured by a veil, and in her hand, the lantern flickered weakly. The bride of Lantern Road. She stood perfectly still, as though waiting for him to draw nearer. Her gown fluttered in the wind, and her delicate hands clutched the lantern tightly. Her mournful sobs echoed through the stillness, a heartbreaking sound that seemed to pierce the very air. Thomas couldn't help but feel a pang of sympathy, though a voice in the back of his mind told him to turn back. But he was too close now, too intrigued by the sight of the bride to retreat. Are you searching for someone?" Thomas asked, his voice trembling slightly. The bride did not answer. She merely stood there, her gaze distant, her sobs growing louder. Suddenly, a sharp cry cut through the silence. It wasn't the bride's voice. No, it was something else. Something deep and primal, like a scream of pure anguish. The sound seemed to come from all directions at once, and in that moment, Thomas felt the ground beneath him tremble. His instincts screamed at him to leave, but his feet were rooted to the spot. The bride began to move, slowly, deliberately, her head turning toward him. Her eyes, though hidden beneath the veil, glowed with an unnatural light, a faint, ghostly blue that seemed to shimmer in the dim glow of the lantern. Her lips parted, and for a moment, Thomas could have sworn he saw a dark, twisted smile beneath the veil. Without warning, she lunged forward, her movements impossibly fast. Thomas stumbled backward, his heart racing as he narrowly avoided her grasp. Her sobs were now a low, guttural sound, like the wail of a woman in pain. But there was something else in the air, something cold and malevolent. Thomas turned and ran, but he could hear her footsteps behind him, echoing through the trees. Her sobs turned to wails of fury, and with each passing step, the air grew colder, heavier, as though the very earth was pulling him down into the darkness. The lantern's light flickered erratically, casting strange, shifting shadows along the road. He ran faster, desperate to escape, but no matter how quickly he moved, the bride's wails grew louder, more insistent. She was gaining on him. Panic surged through his veins and he dared not look back. But then, the lantern's light flashed brightly, blinding him for a moment. When his vision cleared, the world had changed. The road was no longer the familiar path he had been walking. The trees had closed in on him, their trunks twisted and contorted, blocking any way forward. The air was thick with the scent of decay, and the ground beneath his feet was soft, like wet earth, but colder. His breath came in ragged gasps as he turned in circles, searching for any sign of the village, any escape from this nightmare. The bride appeared before him once again, her form looming like a specter in the night. This time, however, she was not alone. A shadowy figure stood beside her, and though it was difficult to see, the outline of a man, pale and lifeless, stood with her, his eyes empty and cold. "You should not have come," the bride whispered, her voice no longer a wail, but a low, almost hypnotic murmur. "You should not have heard my cry. Now you are mine." Before Thomas could react, the shadowy figure lunged at him, its cold hands wrapping around his throat, squeezing the life out of him. His screams were swallowed by the eerie silence of the woods. The bride watched, her expression unreadable, her lantern still glowing faintly in her hand. And then, as quickly as it had begun, it was over. Thomas's body was never found. The villagers whispered in fear, but none of them dared venture onto Lantern Road to search. They knew better than to look for the lost souls who were claimed by the bride. As the days passed, the village returned to its quiet, uneventful rhythm, but a palpable unease lingered in the air. The innkeeper still eyed the road warily each night, as if expecting someone or something to emerge from the shadows. It wasn't until a few weeks later, just before the harvest festival, that the village elder, Merton, gathered the townsfolk to speak of something darker than anyone had realized. Merton had always been a figure of quiet authority in the village, his long white beard and stoic demeanor lending him an air of mystery. He had seen much in his time, and his warnings were often respected by all, even if they were rarely understood. As night fell and the last of the festival lights flickered out, the villagers made their way to the central square, where Merton waited. The air was thick with the smell of wet earth and decaying leaves, the first real chill of autumn creeping into their bones. There was an uneasy tension hanging over the gathering as the elder began his tale. "You've all heard the stories." Merton's gravelly voice cracked through the silence. "The bride of Lantern Road, the woman in white, the one who haunts the path. But you have not heard the true nature of the curse she brings." The crowd shifted uncomfortably, and a murmur rippled through them. "The bride you think you know," Merton continued, "is not simply a wandering spirit lost in grief. No, she was the catalyst of a terrible, dark ritual, a ritual bound by blood and suffering. She was never just a woman. She was chosen to be the vessel that would bring forth the souls of the lost, to feed something darker than you can imagine. And now that something has been awakened." The crowd grew silent, the weight of his words pressing down on them. "She was not the victim," Merton said, his voice low and laden with dread. "She was the instrument. Her death was no accident. It was no cruel twist of fate. It was deliberate. The villagers before us, generations ago, had made a pact with forces that existed in the shadows, beyond the veil of the living. They had sacrificed her, bound her to that lantern, cursed her to forever walk Lantern Road in search of more souls. And in doing so, they awakened the curse." A young woman, too frightened to hold her tongue, stepped forward, her voice trembling. "But why did she choose Thomas? Why him?" Merton's eyes, full of sorrow and regret, glanced down at the ground for a moment. "Because he was the one meant to replace her. It was always meant to be like this." The crowd's murmurs grew louder, but Merton silenced them with a raised hand. "The curse doesn't stop. Once the bride claims a soul, she does not simply take it. Number, the soul becomes part of her, a part of the darkness that binds her to the road. And in the process, that soul becomes something else, something other, a servant, a follower. Thomas is gone, yes, but he is no longer himself. He walks the road now as part of the bride's eternal search for new souls. The villagers, their faces pale and wide-eyed with horror, listened in stunned silence as Merton's words sunk in. None of them had fully understood what had happened to Thomas, or to the others before him. But now it was clear. The bride didn't just hunt, she recruited. For the first time, the villagers understood the true depth of the curse. It was not enough for the bride to merely appear and disappear, for the road to remain a place of eerie mystery. She was building an army. Each time she claimed someone, they were pulled into her thrall, and they too became part of the curse. They would never truly die, at least not in the way the living understood. They would remain on the path, forever bound to the lantern, forever seeking the next soul to take. The wind began to pick up, the sound of its howling whispers tugging at the edges of Merton's words. The villagers shuddered, instinctively pulling closer together, but no one dared to break the silence. Even Merton seemed to be lost in thought, haunted by his own knowledge of the curse. "There is no escaping it," Merton said at last. "Once the lantern shines its light on you, you are bound. The only way to end it, to stop the bride, is to sever the thread that holds her to this world. But that, my friends, is something none of us have the power to do. The bride has long since become something beyond our reach." The wind howled louder, and suddenly there was a light, a faint, flickering glow far off in the distance. The villagers turned toward the lantern's glow, their hearts sinking as the cold air gripped them. Merton's voice dropped to a whisper, barely audible over the wind. "You see? It's begun again. The cycle continues." The glow grew stronger, and then it vanished. But it wasn't the wind. Number. It was something else. The lantern's light flickered on and off, and then it blinked out completely. A few villagers, braver than the others, stood at the edge of the square, eyes straining toward the darkness, waiting. They heard the faintest sound, like soft footsteps on the gravel of Lantern Road. The first whisper drifted through the air, distant and soft, like a sigh carried on the wind. Then another voice followed, and another, until the whispers were no longer faint, but loud, overwhelming, and terrifying. "Thomas!" The wind carried his name, but it wasn't the man they once knew. It was something else now, something empty. "Thomas!" The whisper grew stronger until it was almost a scream. "Join us! Join us!" The lantern was back, this time closer. The figure of a woman in a tattered gown appeared out of the fog. Lantern held high, the faint glow casting eerie shadows on her face. Her veil fluttered in the breeze, her sobs barely audible. But the anguish in her cries was undeniable. But this time something was different. Thomas was with her. His face was pale, his eyes hollow, a look of pain and terror in them. But he didn't speak. He only followed, his eyes locked onto the figure of the bride. His once familiar face now a grim mask of emptiness. The villagers froze, terror gripping them. The bride was not alone anymore. She had her first recruit. Thomas was lost forever. And so it began again. As the days wore on, a sense of unease hung in the air, like a thick fog. The villagers no longer spoke freely of the bride, for fear of drawing her attention. They had learned not to tempt fate by uttering her name or even acknowledging her presence in whispers. Still, they could not escape the growing dread that gripped the heart of their village. The sightings of the bride became more frequent, and those who ventured too close to Lantern Road after dusk vanished without a trace. Some swore they had heard her mournful sobs echoing in the wind, her lantern swaying in the darkness. Merton, the village elder, had seen enough. His aged hands trembled as he pushed open the door to his small cottage, where the dim glow of an oil lamp flickered on the table. He poured himself a drink and sighed deeply, glancing at the map of the village he had kept for years. The land was dotted with forgotten places, sacred grounds long since abandoned, and the twisted path that led to Lantern Road, where the ghostly bride had wandered for generations. As the days passed, Merton's warnings grew more urgent. He had spent his life researching the curse that plagued the village, and he knew that the time was nearing when the bride would claim another soul. The villagers were terrified, and rightfully so, because those who met her were never seen again, And it was said that they did not simply vanish into thin air. No, the bride's victims became part of her eternal procession, bound to Lantern Road forever. The final straw came one moonless night when a young woman named Mary, barely 20, disappeared. Mary had heard the whispers of the bride's sorrow and thought herself brave enough to face the ghost. She was seen walking toward Lantern Road at twilight, holding her head high as though she could conquer the legend. But by dawn, her lantern was found at the edge of the road, swinging in the breeze. There was no sign of Mary. The villagers feared the worst. She had been claimed. It was then that Merton knew he had to act. There was no more time. The bride had begun her final hunt, and it was only a matter of time before she came for someone else. But Merton had one last desperate hope. He remembered the old rites, the ritual that had bound the bride to the road all those years ago. It was dark and twisted, a forbidden practice to bind the spirit of the bride to the land. But Merton had studied it in secret, and now he would have to perform it if there was any hope of saving the village. He gathered a handful of villagers, the bravest of them, to meet him at the edge of Lantern Road. As they stood in the shadow of the ancient trees, the wind shifted and a strange chill filled the air. Merton raised his hand, motioning for the villagers to be silent. He could feel it. The presence of the bride was near. He could hear the soft, mournful sobbing carried on the wind, followed by the unmistakable sound of a lantern swinging in the distance. The villagers exchanged nervous glances. Then from the darkened woods ahead, the glowing light appeared, flickering like a will-o'-the-wisp. The lantern swayed back and forth, casting eerie shadows on the twisted path that led deeper into the forest. And then they saw her, the bride. Her face was pale and featureless, her long white gown tattered and stained with dirt. Her lantern swayed gently in her hands, casting a dim light on her ghostly figure. Her wailing cries filled the air as she moved closer, her feet barely touching the ground. The villagers froze, unable to move as she approached. There was no escaping her now. Merton stepped forward, his voice barely a whisper, as he began the incantation that had been passed down through generations. His words were ancient and strange, the language of the old rituals, long forbidden by the church. The ground trembled beneath their feet, and the bride stopped, her wailing growing louder. She turned her featureless face toward Merton, her eyes empty, like deep voids that swallowed everything around them. The lantern swung wildly, casting grotesque shadows on the trees. Merton continued his chant, his voice shaking with fear. He could feel the power of the ritual taking hold, but he knew it would come at a terrible cost. The bride's spirit was bound to the land, but to sever that connection, to stop the endless cycle of recruitment, someone had to take her place. The bride's figure began to distort, her form shifting like a nightmare coming to life. Her lantern glowed brighter and brighter until it was blinding. The villagers screamed, clutching their eyes as the light burned them. The wind howled and the earth cracked beneath their feet. The bride's wails grew louder, becoming a cacophony of agony, grief, and rage. "You cannot stop me," the bride whispered in a voice that was not her own. It was the voice of every soul she had claimed over the years, their agony and anger seeping through her. "You have no power here." But Merton did not stop. He had reached the final words of the ritual, and he knew what was to come. He had prepared himself, knowing that in order to free the village, he would have to pay the ultimate price. With one final cry, he completed the incantation, and the ground beneath them erupted. The bride's form shattered like glass, her lantern flickering one last time before plunging into darkness. The wind died down, and the trees fell silent. Merton's body collapsed to the ground, lifeless. The villagers watched in horror, knowing what had happened. The bride's spirit was gone, but so was Merton. In his place, where he had fallen, the earth split open, and a dark figure emerged. A new bride, her face twisted with grief and rage. She held a lantern in her hands, its light glowing cold and eerie, as she turned her eyes toward the villagers, and the whispers began again. As the lantern flickered, Merton's face slowly began to change, becoming more hollow, more ghastly. The villagers stood frozen, their minds unable to grasp what had just happened. They could hear the soft sobs of Merton's voice, no longer the elder who had guided them, but now the bride, claiming them, beckoning them to follow. The path ahead was no longer safe, nor was there any escape. The village would always be haunted by the Bride of Lantern Road, and from this moment on, no one would ever be free from her wails, for the ritual had never ended. It had only begun anew. Hollow Glen was a village that time had almost forgotten, tucked deep within the shadow of an ancient forest. Its cobbled streets were cracked and worn, the houses old and bowed from years of neglect. At the village's edge, a dense mist perpetually curled, as if the land itself was holding on to secrets too dark to let go. The villagers, tight-knit and cautious, rarely ventured beyond the safety of their homes after nightfall. They had learned long ago that certain things were best left undisturbed. One legend loomed over them all, the tale of the Headless Horseman. It was a story passed down through the generations, each telling more chilling than the last. On every full moon, the decapitated horseman would ride through the village streets, searching for his lost head. His horse's hooves echoed through the night, the sound sharp and rhythmic as if it could pierce the very soul. Those unlucky enough to encounter him were never seen again, and their houses would be marked with strange claw marks on the walls, as though something had tried to break through. The villagers spoke of it in hushed tones, warning children to stay inside after dark. But there were always those, foolish and brave, who thought the stories were just that, stories. Among them was Thomas, a young man known for his defiance of superstition. His friends laughed and called him reckless. But Thomas was convinced the ghostly tales were nothing more than old folklore meant to frighten the simple folk of Hollow Glen. One evening, as the full moon hung high in the sky, casting an eerie glow over the village, Thomas sat by the fire, listening to the tales of the elders. "The horseman is real," one of them whispered. "I've heard his hooves echoing on the cobblestones many times. No one dares go out on the full moon night." Thomas smirked and stood up, his eyes glinting with a mixture of curiosity and bravado. "I'll prove it," he said, his voice full of youthful arrogance. "I'll go out tonight. There's no horseman. It's just a myth." The villagers gasped, but no one tried to stop him. They knew he wouldn't listen. As Thomas walked toward the door, his mother grabbed his arm, her face pale with fear. "Thomas, please," she begged, "do not go. The Headless Horseman is not a joke. He is real and he will take you." But Thomas pulled away laughing. "I'll be back before you even notice I'm gone." He left the warmth of the fire behind, stepping into the cold night. The streets of Hollow Glen were eerily quiet under the full moon's cold gaze. The village, usually so alive with the sounds of conversation and laughter, now stood in oppressive silence. Thomas walked with purpose, his footsteps echoing in the stillness. As he passed the old houses, he couldn't help but feel a sense of unease creeping into his chest, but he brushed it off. It was just the fear that the villagers had instilled in him, nothing more. He reached the edge of the village where the path led into the thick, dark woods. A chill ran down his spine, and for a moment he almost turned back. But then, the faintest sound reached his ears, the rhythmic thud of hooves on stone. He froze, his breath catching in his throat. The sound was distant at first, but it grew louder, closer, until it seemed to surround him. Thomas felt his heart race as the hooves echoed in the night. He glanced around, but there was no sign of a rider. And yet the sound continued, louder and faster, as though the horse was charging toward him. Suddenly, from the shadows ahead, the figure of a rider appeared, his form illuminated by the pale moonlight. The horseman was cloaked in dark, tattered robes, his head missing. In place of it was only a blackened, gaping hole. The horseman's body was hunched over his steed, his arms outstretched as if he were reaching for something or someone. Thomas's blood ran cold. He stumbled backward, his feet tangling in the uneven ground. The horseman's horse reared up, its hooves striking the air, and the sound of a terrifying, guttural scream tore through the night. What do you want?" Thomas stammered, his voice shaking. The horseman's ghostly form seemed to turn toward him, its empty neck twisting as if sensing his presence. Then, without a word, the horseman raised a skeletal hand, pointing directly at Thomas. The wail that followed was deafening, a shriek so chilling that it seemed to tear at the very fabric of reality. Thomas's heart pounded in his chest, and his instincts screamed at him to run. He turned on his heel, but his legs felt like lead, his body frozen in fear. The horseman rode faster, his hooves striking the earth like thunder, getting closer and closer until Thomas could feel the heat of the horse's breath on his neck. The next thing he knew, he was face to face with the headless specter. His breath came in ragged gasps, but the horseman did not speak. Instead, it raised a bony hand, and Thomas felt his body jerk forward, as though an unseen force had wrapped around him. A deafening crash echoed through the air as Thomas fell to the ground, his body violently pulled backward. His head slammed into the stone path, sending a sharp pain shooting through his skull. But as he struggled to rise, he felt a cold pressure on his neck. His vision blurred, his breath shallow, and before he could scream, the world went dark. The full moon had risen high, casting its silver glow upon the desolate streets of Hollow Glen. A dense fog swirled around the edges of the village, as if the land itself were holding its breath, waiting for the inevitable. The villagers huddled inside their homes, their windows tightly shut, the sound of every creaking floorboard magnified in the silence. The air seemed to grow heavier, thick with the tension that accompanied the headless horseman's return. Thomas's mother, Anna, sat by the hearth, her hands trembling as she clutched a faded shawl around her shoulders. The warmth from the fire did little to ease the cold knot of fear that twisted in her stomach. She hadn't seen Thomas since he'd set off that evening, and now every second without him felt like an eternity. Her mind kept replaying his words, his smug, confident smirk, as he adventured into the night, determined to prove that the legends of the Headless Horseman were nothing more than stories to scare children. But Anna knew the truth. She knew what would come. And in her heart, she feared that her son had already become the latest victim. Suddenly, the distant sound of hooves broke the stillness. It was faint at first, like a whisper on the wind, but then it grew louder, the sound of pounding hooves growing closer with each passing second. Anna's heart began to race. She shot to her feet and ran to the window, her breath fogging the glass as she looked out into the night. The street outside was empty, the cobblestones slick with dew, but she could feel something, someone approaching. Her pulse quickened as the hooves drew nearer, and the ground beneath her feet seemed to tremble in time with each echoing beat. A shape appeared in the distance, a silhouette dark and ominous. It was him, the Headless Horseman. His figure emerged from the fog, riding a black stallion that seemed to glide across the earth, its eyes glowing an eerie red. Anna gasped, stumbling backward. The terror she had long feared was real. The stories, the warnings, all of it, true. Her son's defiance had brought this nightmare to life, and now the price would be paid. The horseman's figure grew closer, and Anna's heart nearly stopped as the rider raised his arms, his empty neck twisting in the direction of her window. There was something hauntingly familiar about the figure, something that chilled her to the core. As if, even without a head, he could still see her. Her breath caught in her throat as she turned away from the window, stumbling into the darkened room. She needed to warn the others, but her legs felt like lead. The horseman's presence was suffocating, pressing in on her from all sides. She had to leave, had to escape, but her feet wouldn't move. The sound of hooves was now deafening, as if the rider was right outside her door, his horse pawing at the earth, impatient. The sound was no longer just an echo. It was real, tangible, and it was closing in. Anna's thoughts raced, and then she remembered the stories she had heard as a child, the same stories the villagers had whispered to one another for generations. The horseman didn't simply seek victims, he took souls. Anna's blood ran cold. Her son's fate had already been sealed, but she couldn't let the rider take anyone else. Desperately, she rushed to the door, pulling it open just as the first echo of the horseman's wail pierced the air. It was a sound that twisted her very soul, a shriek of such agony that it felt like the earth itself cried out in pain. She sprinted into the street, the fog thickening around her, making it difficult to see. The sound of hooves continued to pound in the distance, but it was growing fainter now. Her breath came in ragged gasps as she tried to make sense of what was happening. Had she missed the rider? Was he still nearby? But then through the fog, she saw him, riding straight toward her, his horse's hooves striking the ground with a terrifying force. The rider's form was cloaked in darkness, his shoulders hunched, his body almost impossibly tall. He was coming for her, just as he had come for Thomas. Anna stumbled backward, a cry of terror rising in her throat, but her voice was swallowed by the wailing wind. The horseman was nearly upon her now, his horse rearing up, its eyes glowing with a malevolent light. Anna's heart pounded as she turned and ran, her feet slipping on the slick cobblestones. She could hear the horseman's breath, ragged and deep, as though he were not just chasing her, but hunting her. Every part of her screamed to escape, to flee, but it was too late. The horseman reached out with a skeletal hand, grasping for her. And before she could react, she felt a cold grip tighten around her wrist. The world seemed to spin as her body was yanked backward, pulled toward the rider with terrifying strength. She struggled, trying to break free, but the rider's grip only tightened, his fingers digging into her skin like iron. The horseman's face loomed before her, a void where his head should have been. But in that moment, Anna could feel something more, a presence, a dark force that surrounded her. It wasn't just the horseman's body that she was being drawn toward, but something deeper, something more sinister. The absence of his head, the hollow space where it should have been, seemed to beckon her in, pulling her closer to the very darkness that had consumed him. Her vision blurred, and the ground beneath her feet seemed to shift. She was falling, plummeting into the void, and in that instant, she realized the truth. The headless horseman was not just a ghost. He was a part of something far darker, something that could not be stopped, and now she was part of it too. The rider's scream filled the air, a guttural, bone-chilling wail that seemed to reverberate through the very earth. Anna's body went limp, her vision fading into darkness, and then silence. The world around Anna dissolved into a suffocating blackness. There was no sound, no light, only an overwhelming sense of being pulled into an abyss. Her thoughts, once frantic and clear, now seemed distant and hollow, as if they were fading into the void with her. Her body felt weightless, no longer bound by the earthly forces that had once defined her. Her last, frantic moments of awareness, the horseman's grip on her wrist, the haunting wail of his pursuit, seemed like distant echoes now, swallowed by the infinite darkness. But as time stretched and warped, a new sensation began to creep through the silence. A voice, faint at first, like a whisper in the wind, cut through the blackness. It was a low murmur, indistinct but filled with malice. The voice grew louder, more insistent, and Anna's mind began to sharpen, returning from the void like a swimmer rising from deep waters. Her senses began to return, her skin prickling with the cold and the oppressive weight of the air around her. She was no longer floating. She was standing, her feet touching solid ground. The ground beneath her was wet and cold, and the air reeked of decay. Slowly she opened her eyes, only to find herself standing at the edge of a vast, barren field. The landscape stretched out before her in endless darkness, with no sign of life. The sky overhead was a swirling mass of black clouds, churning violently, as if nature itself had been twisted by some unseen force. The very air around her seemed to hum with an otherworldly energy that made her skin crawl. Anna tried to move, but her legs felt as though they were locked in place. She could feel something, a weight pressing against her chest, constricting her every breath. Her heart pounded in her ears, each beat a sharp reminder that she was no longer in the village she had once known, no longer in the world she had once inhabited. She tried to scream, but her voice caught in her throat. The voice, the whispering voice, grew louder. It was no longer distant. It was right behind her, surrounding her. The words, now unmistakable, rang in her ears. "You were warned, but you were foolish. Now you belong to him." The voice was not human. It was as if the land itself was speaking, a deep, guttural tone that reverberated in her very bones. Panic surged through Anna as she spun around, desperate to see where the voice was coming from. But the field around her remained empty, shrouded in darkness. There was nothing, and then she felt it, the unmistakable presence of something behind her. Something dark, something ancient, something wrong. The cold grip on her wrist tightened again, and Anna froze, her body trembling with terror. The air around her turned freezing, her breath forming invisible clouds before her. She dared not turn around, knowing what she would see. But the force pulling at her was impossible to resist. She had no choice. Anna turned, and there, standing before her, was the headless horseman. But he was not the same as he had been. The rider, once a shadowy figure, was now fully present, an abomination in every sense of the word. His body, though still massive, was contorted and malformed. His black cloak billowed, but it was shredded at the edges, as though it had been ravaged by something beyond the realm of the living. The horse beneath him was no longer a simple steed. It was a monstrous, skeletal beast, its skin rotted and hanging from its bones, its eyes burning with a malevolent glow. The rider's head was still missing, but where his neck had once been was now a void, a swirling mass of dark energy that seemed to shift and writhe like an open wound in reality itself. And then Anna saw it, the terrible truth. His neck was not empty. It was full of eyes, thousands of them, blinking and shifting in an unnatural rhythm. Eyes that stared at her with an intensity so horrifying that she felt her soul quiver in response. The voice whispered again, this time louder, echoing in her mind, clawing at her sanity. "You cannot escape, Anna. You are mine now. You are all ours." Before she could react, the horseman reached out, his skeletal hand wrapping around her throat with inhuman strength. His fingers were cold as ice, and as they tightened, Anna gasped for breath, her vision going dark at the edges. The pressure on her neck was unbearable, but it was not pain that consumed her. It was the overwhelming presence of something ancient, something vast, suffocating her from the inside out. In that moment, Anna knew she was no longer alive. She had passed into a place beyond death, a realm where spirits were not free to rest, but to suffer for eternity. The horseman leaned in, his face a twisted, empty mass of writhing shadows. His voice, no longer a whisper, but a guttural, rasping growl, echoed in Anna's ears. "You defied me, Anna, and now you will serve me." The words pierced her mind, and for the first time since this nightmare had begun, Anna understood the true horror of the Headless Horseman. He was not just a spirit lost in the world. He was a recruiter, a creature that collected souls, that brought them into his fold. And once you were chosen, once you were touched by the horseman, there was no turning back. Anna's last thought, as the darkness closed in on her, was not of her son or her village. It was of her own fate, of how she had been consumed by the very evil she had feared. She had become a part of it, bound to it for eternity. As the horseman's grip on her tightened, the world around her faded. Her body grew colder, her consciousness slipping further away. The darkness enveloped her completely, and then, with one final breath, she was gone. The next morning in the village of Hollow Glen, Thomas's mother was gone. There was no trace of her, not even a sign of her struggle. Only a single faint claw mark etched into the doorframe where she had last stood. But something had changed. The villagers spoke in hushed tones, for the haunting presence of the Headless Horseman had only grown stronger, and rumors spread. Rumors of a new figure seen riding through the foggy streets of Hollow Glen at night, its shape familiar, its head still missing. A new recruit had been added to the horseman's dark army. Anna's soul was now bound to him forever, lost in the endless night, and the village of Hollow Glen would never be the same again. In the small village of Ravensbrook, nestled among the twisted trees and rocky cliffs of the northern moors, there was a ruin, a crumbling chapel that had once been the heart of the community. Time and weather had worn it down to little more than broken walls and a roof that caved in long ago. But even in its dilapidated state, there was something about it that still drew people in. The legend of the Screaming Widow. It was said that every midnight, when the moon was high and the wind carried the scent of decay, a woman appeared in the chapel ruins. Dressed in a tattered black gown, her hair wild and tangled, she stood in the middle of the broken nave and let out a piercing scream. The villagers claimed that the sound of her wail was so mournful, so filled with despair, that it could drive a person mad just by hearing it. Those who had dared to venture into the chapel at night had never returned, or if they did, they were never quite the same. They would speak of shadows moving in the dark, of whispers that crawled into their ears, of eyes watching them from every corner of the ruin. But always it was the widow's scream that haunted them the most, a sound that lingered in their minds, gnawing at their sanity until they could no longer tell where the dream ended and reality began. It was on a crisp autumn evening that Ethan, a young historian from the nearby town, arrived in Ravensbrook. He had heard the stories, of course, everyone had. But as a scholar of the macabre and the unexplained, Ethan wasn't one to shy away from a mystery. He had studied the legends of the chapel and the widow, but something in his research had gnawed at him. No one truly knew who she was or why she screamed. It was simply accepted as one of the village's oldest and darkest secrets. As he stood at the edge of the chapel ruins, gazing at the crumbled stone walls and the twisted trees that surrounded the place, a chill ran down his spine. The evening had turned darker faster than he had expected, and the wind began to stir, carrying with it a faint, unsettling cry. The sound was distant at first, like the faintest whisper of a woman in distress, but it quickly grew louder, more desperate. Ethan's heart raced, but his curiosity pushed him forward. He had come to Ravensbrook to uncover the truth, not to turn back in fear, and so with a deep breath, he stepped over the broken threshold of the chapel, the air growing colder with each step he took. The inside of the chapel was shrouded in darkness, save for the pale light of the full moon filtering through the cracks in the walls. Shadows seemed to writhe in the corners, flickering in strange patterns that made Ethan's skin crawl. But it was the silence that unsettled him the most. Despite the howling wind outside, the chapel was eerily still, as if the world beyond had ceased to exist. And then it came, the scream. It started low, a mournful wail that echoed through the ruins, reverberating off the stone walls. It was the scream of a woman in unbearable pain, in anguish that seemed to stretch through the ages. Ethan froze, his breath catching in his throat. The sound filled him, made his heart pound in his chest, and sent a shiver down his spine. But there was something more to it, something deeper than just sorrow. There was an anger in the cry, a desperation that hinted at something far darker than grief. Ethan stepped deeper into the ruins, following the sound, his every instinct screaming at him to turn back. But he couldn't. He had to know. As the midnight hour approached, Ethan found himself standing in the center of the chapel, where the altar had once stood. The air was thick with the weight of centuries, and the faintest hint of something foul lingered in the corners of the ruin. The scream came again, louder now, a chilling wail that seemed to shake the very ground beneath his feet. And then she appeared. The widow materialized before him, her form shrouded in shadow. Her black gown billowed in the windless air, her wild hair whipping around her face, obscuring her features. She stood at the far end of the chapel, her back to him, and the scream that tore from her throat was so raw, so filled with anguish, that it felt as though it could rip the very soul from his body. Ethan's heart raced, but he couldn't look away. There was something hypnotic about the woman, something in her pain that called to him. She turned slowly, her face emerging from the darkness. Her eyes were hollow, sunken, as though she had not slept in years, and her skin was deathly pale. Her lips moved, but no words came, only more screams. And then suddenly she stopped. The widow fell to her knees, her hands clutching at her chest, as though she were being torn apart from the inside. Ethan felt a coldness wash over him, the temperature dropping so sharply that his breath fogged in the air. The widow's screams grew quieter, then almost imperceptible, as though they were being swallowed by the ruin itself. Ethan hesitated, torn between the overwhelming urge to run and the need to uncover the truth. He stepped closer, his voice barely a whisper. "Who are you?" he asked, his words carrying a weight he hadn't intended. The widow's head snapped up, her hollow eyes locking onto his with a sudden, unnatural intensity. For a moment, the chapel seemed to hold its breath, the wind outside stilling, the very earth beneath them frozen in time. And then, In a voice that sounded like it came from the depths of hell, the widow spoke. "You should not have come here," she hissed, her voice cracking like brittle bones. "You should never have come." Ethan took a step back, his mind racing. "Who are you? Why do you scream?" The widow's lips twisted into a grotesque smile, one that was both tragic and terrifying. "I was not a victim," she whispered. "I am the murderer." Ethan stood frozen in the center of the chapel, unable to move as the widow's hollow gaze locked onto him. The wailing, shrill and aching, reverberated around him, vibrating through the stone walls like 1,000 voices calling out for mercy. Her once pristine black gown fluttered around her, now ragged and stained with the passage of time. She took a step closer, her body jerking unnaturally, and the whisper of her breath was a suffocating presence in the heavy air. "You should have left long ago," she whispered, her voice thick with despair, her eyes wide and wild. "But now you're here. You cannot escape." Ethan could feel the weight of her words settle like a leaden weight in his chest. His heart raced and his body trembled as if he had stepped into a trap from which there was no return. The air around him seemed to grow colder, the oppressive weight of guilt and sorrow hanging heavy in the ruin. The widow's cry rang louder, each shriek digging into the corners of his mind, scraping against his sanity like nails on a chalkboard. He struggled to breathe, the very essence of the place squeezing the life out of him, as if the chapel itself were suffocating him with its mournful history. "I never wanted to be this," the widow muttered, her eyes flickering with something almost human. "I didn't want this fate, but I had no choice. I had no choice." Ethan's lips parted, his voice a whisper against the madness that surrounded him. "What happened here? Why are you cursed?" The widow's hollow eyes flickered with recognition, her gaze narrowing with a slow, haunting smile. She tilted her head as if trying to decide whether to speak the truth or keep it buried with her memories. The wailing grew faint, but the coldness in the chapel thickened, as though the stones themselves listened for the widow's confession. "I was once just like you," she said, her voice now trembling. "I had a life, so full of love, so full of promise, but that was before the night." She took another step closer to him, her fingers outstretched. The faintest trace of bloodstains marred her hands, as though they had never been washed clean. Ethan took a step back, instinctively moving away from her touch, but his body still refused to obey fully. The atmosphere was choking, pulling at him, as if invisible chains held him in place. The widow's form shifted, her movements growing erratic and jerking, as though her spirit was struggling to stay coherent. She was unraveling, torn between what she had been and what she had become. "The night my family died," she continued, her voice barely audible, "I did not think I could take it anymore. The pain, the suffering, it overwhelmed me. They were so close to me, yet so far. My husband, my children, everything I loved, gone in the blink of an eye. But it wasn't them. It was me." Ethan's mind raced. The widow spoke as though she had not been the victim of tragedy, but the architect of it. Something about her confession felt like it was drawing him in, pulling him into a place he wasn't sure he wanted to be. The wails softened, replaced by the sharp, dissonant sound of a heartbeat, echoing in the silence of the ruin. I thought I could fix things," she muttered, her voice quivering with anguish. But there was no fixing what I had already broken. Suddenly, the walls of the chapel seemed to groan and shift. The wind howled louder outside, but inside it was as though the very stones of the place were speaking to Ethan, murmuring secrets he was not ready to hear. Shadows stretched long across the chapel floor, and the light from the moon filtering through the cracked windows danced on the broken pews, casting strange twisting shapes on the walls. "Do you hear it?" The widow's voice was now frantic, almost desperate. "The whispers? They speak of what I did. They speak of how I killed them. But they won't leave me. They never leave me." Ethan's heart raced, the terror closing in around him, as her words cut into his soul. The room felt as though it were pressing in from all sides, every corner filled with the weight of unseen eyes watching him. "I didn't mean for it to happen," the widow continued, her face now contorted in pain, her fingers clutching at the air, as if trying to grasp something out of reach. But they were suffocating me. I was drowning in their lives, their endless need for me. And one night, in a rage, I ended it. The widow collapsed to the floor, her body racked with sobs that shook her fragile form. Ethan's breath caught in his throat as he watched her, trapped between horror and disbelief. This was the source of the wailing, her unbearable guilt, twisted into a never-ending scream that filled the chapel, never allowing her peace. Please, please tell me how to stop it, she begged, her voice breaking with the weight of her remorse. How can I stop this? Ethan didn't know how to respond. His mind reeled, trying to comprehend the magnitude of what he was hearing. He was torn between fear and pity, wanting to run but feeling drawn toward the woman before him. She was not just a spirit of sorrow. She was something else, something far more dangerous. Her guilt had transformed her into something monstrous. Her eyes suddenly locked onto his with terrifying intensity, and Ethan felt his body seize up, a cold sweat breaking out along his brow. The widow's eyes, wide and dark, seemed to pierce into his very soul. You can't leave, she whispered, her voice trembling. None of us can leave. You must stay. Ethan opened his mouth to protest, to ask what she meant, but the words caught in his throat as the temperature in the chapel plunged further. The very walls of the chapel seemed to pulse with an unnatural energy, and Ethan felt an icy hand grip his heart, pulling him deeper into the nightmare. The shadows around the chapel seemed to stir, coming alive as the widow's voice dropped to a low, eerie growl. The blood will call, she murmured, almost as if chanting. The blood will call, and you will answer. You are the next one to join us. The chapel seemed to close in on him as the air thickened, and the temperature dropped further. Ethan's legs felt as though they were filled with lead, the weight of the curse pulling him deeper into the center of the chapel. The widow's face twisted, her once mournful expression now contorted with madness. Her body jerked again, her limbs moving in spasms, and the sound of the wailing returned. Louder, more guttural, as though it were coming from all around him. Ethan tried to scream, but no sound emerged from his mouth. His limbs refused to move, as if the very air had turned to stone around him. The widow reached out toward him, her fingers clawing at the air, desperate to make contact. And then, as if to answer her call, the air grew heavier, and the shadows stretched out toward Ethan, crawling up the walls and toward the floor. The chapel seemed to twist and bend in impossible ways as the spirits of the widow's victims, their faces twisted in agony, emerged from the walls, reaching toward him with skeletal hands. Join us, the widow hissed, her voice now a chilling command. Join the others, and never leave. Ethan's heart pounded in his chest, a rhythmic terror that matched the widow's unearthly wail. The air around him grew colder with every breath he took, the heavy scent of decay seeping through the cracked stone walls of the chapel. He stood frozen, barely able to breathe, as the widow's figure hovered before him, her once beautiful face now a grotesque mask of despair and rage. You don't understand. Her voice was soft, the anguish in it almost unbearable. You don't know what I did. Ethan felt a chill crawl up his spine, a strange mix of dread and curiosity gnawing at him. He stepped closer, despite every instinct screaming at him to flee. There was something in her words, a trembling vulnerability that contradicted the raw, terrifying scream she had been unleashing since his arrival. What are you? Ethan whispered, his voice shaking, unsure of whether he truly wanted to know the answer. The widow's eyes, bloodshot and wild, fixed on him with such intensity that Ethan stumbled back. Her form flickered, like the faintest wisp of smoke in the wind, before solidifying again. Do you think I am a victim, young man? She asked, her tone suddenly sharp, like a knife edge. That I scream because of what was done to me? Ethan's breath caught in his throat. She didn't seem to wait for a response, her voice trembling with a deep sorrow. I was not the victim. I was the monster, the killer. It was I who butchered my own family, who drove the blade through the hearts of those I swore to love. Her laugh was dry, jagged, the sound of nails scraping against stone. I was the one who caused the massacre. I killed them all. Ethan's head swam with disbelief. He took a step back, stumbling into the cold stone altar, the impact sending a ripple through the dust that lay undisturbed for centuries. "No!" Ethan stammered, shaking his head in denial. "That can't be true. You were—" He couldn't finish. How could he finish a sentence like that? How could he fathom that the innocent, crying widow he'd seen through the fog, her image so full of sorrow and pain, was responsible for such horrors? She nodded slowly, the tears still streaming down her face, but now they were mixed with a bitter anger. "Yes," she said, voice breaking. "It was me. I was the one who murdered them. My husband, my children. I thought it was for love, for my own twisted version of it." She paused, letting the confession hang in the air like a poison. "But now I am cursed to walk this earth for eternity, trapped by my own guilt. I can never escape what I did." Ethan could barely process her words. He felt a knot of horror twisting in his stomach as he struggled to comprehend the weight of what she was saying. The chapel, the spirits, everything, the widow's cries, they weren't just the tragic consequences of a massacre. They were the byproduct of her own unspeakable actions. The terror she had instilled in this forsaken place was born from her sins, and her spirit, tormented by guilt, had become something far darker. The wind outside howled, rattling the broken windows of the chapel, sending a sudden chill through the already frigid air. The widow's wails grew louder, as though they were no longer cries of sorrow, but of something far more malevolent. She stepped closer, her eyes now wide, manic with desperation. "I can't stop it," she whispered, almost pleading, her hands trembling as she reached toward him. "The curse, the pain, it's all I have left. And now you are part of it. You will never leave this place." Ethan's blood turned to ice as her words sank in. A searing pain shot through his chest like a deep, gnawing wound that never healed. He clutched at his chest, gasping for air as he staggered backward. The chapel seemed to distort, the walls warping, twisting as though they were alive, hungry for his very soul. "No," Ethan whispered hoarsely, panic rising in his throat. "I have to leave. I have to." But the widow was upon him now, her face twisted in agony, her mouth gaping open to emit a sound that was not human. More like the screech of something primal, something ancient and monstrous. The force of her scream seemed to vibrate through his bones, paralyzing him in place. Ethan's legs buckled beneath him, and he collapsed to the cold, hard stone floor. His vision blurred, and for a moment, everything went dark. But then, from the corner of his eye, he saw it, the altar, now bathed in an unnatural red light, the shadows forming shapes that were not human. And there, standing amidst the shadows, was the figure of the man whose death had begun it all. His eyes, hollow and dark, fixed on Ethan with an eerie sense of recognition, as though he had been waiting for Ethan to fall into this very trap. The widow's voice returned, but it was no longer her own. It was 1,000 voices, all of them crying out in pain and fury, each one more terrifying than the last. "You shouldn't have come here," the voice whispered, now all around him, in his ears, in his mind. "You'll never escape." Ethan's vision flickered, and in that fleeting moment, he saw the chapel in its original, intact form, the pews, the stained glass windows, and the altar, all covered in blood. And beneath the altar, the writhing shapes of bodies, the twisted faces of his own ancestors, their eyes pleading, their mouths frozen in screams. It was then that Ethan understood. The chapel was never just a building. It was a prison of souls, bound forever by the widow's curse. And now it was his prison too. He tried to scream, but no sound came. His body was being drawn toward the altar, toward the writhing shadows. The pain in his chest intensified, the blood draining from his face as he was dragged closer, the whispers in his ear louder now, urging him to surrender. And just as his vision began to fade completely, the widow's voice echoed one final time. "Now, you are one of us." The next morning, the villagers of the nearby town awoke to the eerie silence of the chapel ruins. A thick fog rolled in from the forest, obscuring the ruins from view. But as the wind howled through the trees, the unmistakable sound of crying echoed from the chapel. It was louder than before, more frantic, and the whispers. They were everywhere. Somewhere deep within the chapel, Ethan's scream joined the chorus. It had been a long day on the road. The winding, narrow path had become an endless expanse of trees, and the air was thick with the scent of pine and wet earth. William, his wife Lily, and their two children, Emma and Thomas, were grateful when they stumbled upon a quaint village nestled in the valley between two steep hills. They had been traveling for hours with no signs of civilization, and the sight of houses, smoke curling from chimneys, and warm light spilling from windows was a welcome relief. "This place looks perfect," Lily said, her voice full of exhaustion. "It's not on the map, but it seems so peaceful." William, always the skeptic, raised an eyebrow. "It's not on the map for a reason, but let's take a look. We could use a break." As they entered the village, the cobblestone streets seemed almost too picturesque. The houses were made of stone and timber, with ivy creeping up their walls. Lanterns hung from posts, casting a warm golden light. There were no signs of modern life, no cars, no electricity, but there was an old-world charm that felt oddly comforting. The village square was empty, except for a few villagers, all of whom greeted them with friendly smiles and waves. An older man with a white beard approached them. "You've come just in time for dinner," the man said. His voice was raspy but kind. "We don't get many visitors around here, especially not at this hour. But don't worry, you're welcome to stay the night." William glanced at Lily, and she smiled back at him, nodding. It felt like a stroke of luck, especially after such a long journey. They were exhausted, and the prospect of a warm meal and a place to sleep seemed too good to pass up. "We'd be grateful," William said. The man led them to a modest inn near the village square. The innkeeper, a woman with kind eyes, greeted them and showed them to a small, cozy room upstairs. The beds were simple, but the sheets were clean, and the room was warm with the scent of burning wood from the hearth downstairs. "Rest well," the innkeeper said with a smile. "Dinner will be ready shortly." As the family unpacked and settled in, they couldn't help but feel a sense of tranquility. The village seemed untouched by time, a hidden place untouched by the chaos of the outside world. Emma and Thomas played in the small courtyard outside, their laughter echoing through the air. The sound was soothing, and for the first time in weeks, William felt a sense of peace he hadn't known in years. When they gathered downstairs for dinner, the table was set with hearty dishes of roasted meats, vegetables, and fresh bread. The other villagers, mostly elderly, sat around the table, chatting warmly with one another, sharing stories that William couldn't quite follow. But the atmosphere was warm, the laughter genuine, and the food delicious. It felt like they had found a forgotten paradise. Later that night, as they retired to their room, Emma and Thomas fell asleep quickly, exhausted from the long day of travel. William and Lily sat by the window, gazing out at the village, which seemed even more serene in the moonlight. "This place, it feels like we're the only ones here," Lily whispered, her voice low. "Almost too perfect, don't you think?" William nodded, his instincts as a traveler telling him that something wasn't quite right. But for now they were safe, and the quiet comfort of the village seemed to quiet his worries. "Maybe we finally found a place to rest." But as the hours passed, William couldn't shake the sense that something was off. The village was still too quiet, too peaceful. No sounds of animals in the woods, no distant sounds of the usual village life, just the faint breeze rustling through the trees. As he lay in bed, drifting into a restless sleep, the faint whisper of voices echoed in his mind. They sounded like faint murmurs from the village square, but when he listened harder, the voices seemed to come from all around, soft and unintelligible. William awoke with a start. The sun was already high in the sky, and he had slept later than usual. He glanced at the clock, but it wasn't there. There was no clock in the room. Lily was still asleep beside him, and the children were nowhere to be seen. He rose from the bed and walked to the window, but when he looked outside, there was no sign of the village. No cobblestone streets, no houses, just a thick fog that seemed to stretch endlessly, wrapping around everything in sight. Confused, he opened the door and stepped out into the courtyard. There was nothing, No village, no inn, just an empty field, and beyond it, the dense fog that swallowed up everything. He stumbled back into the room, his heart racing. He shook Lily awake, and she sat up with a gasp, looking around in confusion. "Where's the village?" William asked, his voice trembling. "Where's everyone?" Lily stared at him, her expression blank. "What do you mean? The village? It's right outside. We just ate dinner last night. The people, they were so kind." William shook his head, fear beginning to grip him. "There's nothing here. Just fog." The children appeared at the door, looking equally confused. "Where's the village, Daddy?" Thomas asked, his voice small. William ran his hands through his hair, trying to make sense of it all. He opened the door again, this time stepping outside. There was no sign of the village. No cobblestones, no smoke, no life. Just an endless expanse of fog and a feeling of eerie emptiness. "We need to leave," William said, his voice tight with panic. They hurriedly gathered their belongings, but as they moved toward the road, a cold wind whipped through the fog. They had no idea which direction to go, and with every step they took, the fog seemed to deepen, closing in around them. And then, as if by magic, a figure emerged from the mist, a figure they had seen only the night before. The old man with the white beard, the one who had welcomed them into the village, stood before them, his expression unreadable. "Leaving so soon?" the man asked, his voice cold and distant. "The village is just ahead." William opened his mouth to speak, but before he could say anything, the man's form began to shift, his body melting into the mist, disappearing as if he had never been there. The family was left standing alone in the endless fog, surrounded by the eerie silence. The world around them seemed to stretch endlessly, and no matter which direction they walked, there was nothing but fog. Hours passed, then days, but the fog never cleared. They were trapped in a timeless void. Days turned into weeks, and yet the family didn't age. Their hunger didn't grow. Their clothes stayed fresh, their bodies untouched by the passage of time. But still, they could find no way out. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the fog lifted. They found themselves standing on the edge of a familiar road, the same road they had taken before their encounter with the village. The world was different now. It was as though no time had passed. No sign of the village remained. The sun was bright, the air fresh, and yet something was wrong. Something had changed. They returned home, but it was no longer the same. People who they had known before looked at them with confusion. The years had passed, but for the family it was as though they had never left. And in the dead of night, a knocking echoed at their door, a sound that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. The family returned to their home with a sense of unnatural relief. The fog had lifted, and the world appeared unchanged on the surface. The roads were as they had always been. The trees lining the path swayed gently in the breeze, and the sun shone with a crisp clarity. But something was deeply wrong, an unspoken dissonance vibrating beneath the surface, tugging at William's mind. When they arrived at the door of their house, they stood in stunned silence. The house seemed unchanged, but as they entered, there was a chill that wrapped around their hearts. "Something feels off," Lily whispered, her voice shaking as she stepped inside. "It's like we've been gone much longer than we thought." The children seemed unaffected, running through the house with the same energy as always. Emma and Thomas laughed and called to each other, their voices echoing through the empty halls. But William and Lily felt an overwhelming dread settle in their chests. The air was thick with something that didn't belong. They tried to carry on as usual, making dinner, preparing for bed. But every time William looked at the clock, he could see time moving. Yet something about the passage of it seemed wrong. It was as though every second dragged on longer than it should have, like the world was slowing down around them. That night, after putting the children to bed, William found himself awake in the middle of the night. He couldn't shake the unsettling feeling that had crept into his bones. The clock showed that it was nearly 3 a.m, but he didn't feel tired. Instead, there was a restless energy coursing through him, urging him to go outside. He stood from the bed, careful not to wake Lily, and quietly made his way downstairs. The house was silent, save for the faint hum of the refrigerator and the occasional creak of the floorboards. He stepped out the front door and into the night. The world outside was blanketed in an eerie calm. The moon was high in the sky, casting long shadows over the trees. The air smelled fresh, but with a bitter undertone, like rain on dry earth. He stood in the yard for a moment, staring into the distance. But as his eyes adjusted to the night, he saw something. No, someone, moving near the edge of the woods. A figure dressed in tattered clothes walked slowly toward him. The person's face was obscured by the darkness, but William's heart skipped a beat when he recognized the familiar shape of the figure. The old man with the white beard, the one who had greeted them in the village. But this time the figure moved with an unnatural fluidity, his body shifting and contorting with every step. His smile twisted, stretching unnaturally wide as he stepped closer, his eyes glowing faintly in the moonlight. "Leaving so soon again?" the old man whispered, his voice low and gravelly. William froze. The air grew thick around him, the once comforting breeze now cold and suffocating. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came. His heart raced as he watched the figure approach. The man stopped just in front of him, a wicked grin spreading across his face. "Where do you think you are, William?" the old man hissed. "Do you think you've escaped?" Before William could react, the world around him shifted. The ground beneath his feet seemed to collapse, and the once familiar trees twisted and bent, their branches stretching toward him like skeletal hands. The fog returned in an instant, swallowing the entire landscape, and the village reappeared. But it was different, darker, decayed. The houses were no longer welcoming. They stood in ruins, their windows shattered and their doors hanging open like empty mouths. A bone-chilling wind howled through the village as the figure before William melted into the shadows. "You're not supposed to leave," the voice of the man echoed from all directions, swirling around William's head. "You never left. You were always here." William's chest tightened. Panic began to claw at him, but his legs felt like lead. His body refused to move. He tried to scream, but no sound escaped his mouth. Suddenly, a familiar sound pierced the silence, the distant echo of a bell tolling. The same bell that had rung when they arrived in the village, signaling their entrance into a nightmare they had never truly escaped. The bell tolled again, and then again, louder, more insistent, until it felt as though the very earth beneath his feet was trembling with its force. And then, in the distance, he saw them, the villagers. But they were not alive. Their faces were gaunt, their eyes hollow, their bodies limp and broken. They moved slowly toward him, their mouths open in silent screams. Their eyes, once kind, now glowed with an unnatural malice. "Help us," they whispered in unison, their voices hollow, their mouths wide as they moved closer, dragging their bodies toward him. "Help us," they repeated, their voices becoming louder, more desperate, until the words felt like a physical force pressing against William's chest. "Help us, or join us." William couldn't breathe. His heart pounded against his rib cage as the villagers closed in. He turned to run, but the fog swallowed him whole, and then the ground beneath him collapsed. When William awoke, he was no longer in the village. He was back in the familiar surroundings of his own home. But it wasn't the same. The house was cold, the windows cracked and covered in dust. The walls were warped and peeling, and the silence was suffocating. He stood up, his body aching, and staggered toward the door. As he reached for the handle, he noticed something strange. The door was locked from the outside. He turned and looked back at the empty room. There was no sign of Lily, Emma, or Thomas. Panic began to rise in his throat as he searched the house, calling their names. But no one answered. As he stepped outside, the world around him was even darker than before. The sky was a dull gray, and the air was thick with an unnatural fog. The village was gone. There was no trace of it anywhere. "Where are they?" William whispered to himself. And then, as though in response, a voice broke through the fog, a voice that made his blood run cold. "Daddy, we're here." It was Emma's voice, but it was wrong. It was distorted, echoing through the fog as though it was coming from all directions. William spun around, his heart racing, but he saw nothing. "Emma!" he called out desperately. And then from the shadows a figure stepped forward, a figure that made William's stomach turn. It was Emma, but her eyes were empty, black holes in her face, her skin pale and stretched tight over her bones. Her mouth was open, but no sound came out. Only the hollow echoes of her voice filled the air. "Help us," she whispered again. Suddenly, a sharp pain shot through William's chest. He gasped for breath, his hands clutching at his heart. The fog around him thickened, and the world seemed to fold in on itself. And then, with one final scream, William's head was torn from his shoulders. The family had never left. They were always meant to stay, lost in the fog, bound to the village that would never truly disappear. In time, others would wander into the village, unaware of the fate that awaited them. And when the bell tolled, they would join the others, lost forever in the fog, their screams echoing through the empty, decaying streets of the village that could never die.